Today, I've prepared the biography of Queen Elizabeth II. Before you fall asleep, make sure to tell us from where you're listening and what time it is. Now, calm down and listen to the story while falling asleep. I'm wishing you a cozy and comfortable night. Welcome to our gentle journey through the remarkable life of Queen Elizabeth II. As you settle into your bed, allow your body to sink into the mattress, feeling the weight of the day gradually lifting away. The story of Britain's longest reigning monarch will unfold softly in your ears as you drift toward peaceful slumber. Her 7-decade reign spanned an era of tremendous change, which we'll explore together in hushed tones as your breathing becomes deeper and more rhythmic. So pull your blankets a little closer, find that perfect position, and let the soothing tale of duty, service, and quiet strength guide you into your dreams. In the gentle light of an April morning in 1926, as spring blossomed across the English countryside, a little princess was born. Her name was Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, and though none could know it then, this tiny child would one day become one of the longest reigning monarchs in British history. Born on April 21st in a quiet townhouse at 17 Bruton Street in London's fashionable Mayfair district, the baby girl arrived into a world still healing from the wounds of the Great War, a time when the British Empire stretched across the globe, and the rhythms of royal life followed centuries-old traditions. Little Elizabeth was born not as an heir to the throne, but as the daughter of the Duke and Duchess of York. Her father, Prince Albert, known affectionately as Bertie to his family, was the second son of King George V, while her mother, the former Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, came from an ancient Scottish noble family. The young couple had been married for 3 years when their first daughter arrived, bringing joy to the York household and to the wider royal family. The townhouse where Elizabeth was born belonged to her maternal grandparents, the Earl and Countess of Strathmore. It was a warm and loving home, filled with the soft ticking of antique clocks and the gentle rustle of fine curtains stirring in the spring breeze. Outside, London was changing, embracing the modern age with motorcars puttering along its streets and wireless sets bringing news and entertainment into homes across the city. But within the walls of 17 Bruton Street, time seemed to move more slowly, cushioned by privilege and tradition. When she was just a few weeks old, the infant princess was christened in the private chapel of Buckingham Palace, wrapped in a delicate lace christening gown that had been worn by royal babies since Victorian times. The Archbishop of Canterbury performed the ceremony, using water from the River Jordan, as her 5 godparents looked on. Her grandfather, King George V, a stern figure with a naval beard and piercing eyes, was said to have softened at the sight of his tiny granddaughter. Elizabeth's early years unfolded in a gentle rhythm of nursery routines. Her childhood was one of comfort and security, though not of extravagance by royal standards. The Duke and Duchess of York were known for their relatively simple tastes and their desire to give their children as normal an upbringing as possible within the confines of royal duty. The family divided their time between their London home at 145 Piccadilly, a tall, elegant townhouse with high-ceilinged rooms and a garden where young Elizabeth could play, and Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, where she could enjoy the freedom of country life. In 1930, when Elizabeth was 4 years old, her sister Margaret Rose was born, giving the little princess a playmate and companion. The two sisters formed a close bond that would endure throughout their lives. Despite their different temperaments, the princess's days followed a gentle pattern. They would wake in their nursery rooms, with their beds positioned side by side, the morning light filtering through lace curtains onto polished wooden floors. Breakfast would be served on small tables, often porridge with cream and brown sugar, followed by lessons with coffee. The girls learned reading, writing, arithmetic, poetry, and history, with Elizabeth showing a particular aptitude for languages and a remarkable memory for details. In the afternoons, they might ride their ponies in Windsor Great Park or play in the miniature Welsh cottage, Y. B.W. Thin Bach, or the little house, which had been presented to Elizabeth as a gift from the people of Wales on her 6th birthday. The little house was a perfect child-sized dwelling, with running water, electricity, and tiny furniture built to scale. Here, the princesses could play at keeping house, arranging flowers in diminutive vases, setting the small table with china tea sets, and pretending to cook meals on the working miniature stove. It was a magical place for childhood imagination to flourish, a place where even princesses could pretend to live ordinary lives. Music filled the York household. The Duchess played the piano, and both girls were given lessons. Elizabeth showed a natural sense of rhythm and enjoyed singing. There were dancing lessons too, with Elizabeth learning the traditional Scottish reels that were a part of her mother's heritage. In quiet evenings, the family might gather for the Duchess to read stories aloud, her gentle Scottish accent giving warmth to tales of adventure and far-off lands. As Elizabeth grew, her love for animals became apparent. Her father gave her her first pony, a Shetland named Peggy, when she was just 4 years old, beginning a lifelong passion for horses and riding. Dogs, too, were beloved companions. The royal family was particularly fond of corgis, and in 1933, when Elizabeth was 7, she received her first corgi, named Dookie. Later came Jane, and from these two descended a long line of royal corgis that would become as much a part of the Queen's image as her handbag and her pearls. The young princess's world expanded beyond the nursery as she began to understand more about her family's place in British life. On ceremonial occasions, she would watch from windows or balconies as her grandfather, King George V, processed in state with her grandmother, Queen Mary, a formidable figure in her toque hats and laden with magnificent jewels. These glimpses of royal pageantry were part of Elizabeth's education in the heritage she would one day inherit. Though at this time, there was no expectation that she would ever become queen. In 1936, when Elizabeth was 10 years old, her grandfather died. His eldest son, her uncle David, became King Edward VI. But before the year was out, the new king had decided to abdicate the throne to marry the woman he loved, the American divorcee Wallis Simpson. This decision sent shockwaves through the royal family and the nation. Suddenly, Elizabeth's father became King George VI, and she herself became heir presumptive to the British throne. This unexpected turn of events changed Elizabeth's life profoundly. The family moved from their comfortable home at 145 Piccadilly to the vast, drafty spaces of Buckingham Palace. The palace, with its 775 rooms, long corridors, and formal state apartments, was a far cry from the relative coziness of their former home. For a shy, serious child of 10, it must have been both impressive and intimidating to find herself living in this historic building. With its red-coated guards and centuries of royal history embedded in its walls, Elizabeth's education now took on a new significance, while her sister Margaret continued with a more typical education for young ladies of their class. Elizabeth began to receive instruction in constitutional history and law. Sir Henry Martin, the vice provost of Eton College, would come to the palace to teach the young princess about the complex system of government she would one day oversee. She studied the history of the monarchy, the role of Parliament, and the relationships between Britain and its empire and Commonwealth. Despite these weighty additions to her curriculum, Elizabeth's education remained in many ways traditional for an upper-class girl of her era. There was no thought of sending her to school or university. Instead, she was taught at home, with an emphasis on languages, literature, music, and the social graces that would be essential for her future role. She became fluent in French, a skill that would serve her well in later diplomatic engagements. As the 1930s progressed, shadows began to gather over Europe. The rise of fascism in Germany and Italy, and the growing threat of another war, could not be kept entirely from the awareness of the young princesses. Though their parents tried to shield them from the worst of the worries, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, the former Duchess of York, became symbols of national resolve as tensions increased. They visited areas of the country affected by economic depression, bringing royal attention to the hardships faced by many Britons during this difficult decade. When war finally came in September 1939, Elizabeth was 13 years old. There was discussion about sending the princesses to Canada for safety, as many children of privilege were being evacuated to the Commonwealth or to the United States. But the Queen firmly rejected this idea, saying, "The children won't go without me. I won't leave without the king." Instead, The princesses were sent to Windsor Castle, which became their wartime home. Its thick stone walls, offering better protection than the more vulnerable Buckingham Palace. Life at Windsor during the war years took on a different rhythm. The ancient castle, parts of which dated back to William the Conqueror, became a haven for the young princesses. They continued their studies, but now there were air raid drills to practice and gas masks to carry. The grounds of the castle were partly given over to growing vegetables. As part of the Dig for Victory campaign that encouraged Britons to grow their own food during a time of strict rationing, Elizabeth and Margaret did their part for the war effort. They became involved with the Girl Guides, the British equivalent of the Girl Scouts. With meetings held within the castle grounds, they collected items for the war effort, knitted for soldiers, and put on Christmas pantomimes to raise funds for the Queen's Wool Fund, which supplied knitted garments to servicemen. These activities gave the princesses a taste of the kind of community service that would become a hallmark of Elizabeth's long reign. As Elizabeth entered her teenage years, the war continued to shape her experiences. She began to take on more public roles, making her first radio broadcast in October 1940, when she was just 14. Her clear, steady voice carried a maturity beyond her years, hinting at the composed public figure she would become. In 1942, when she turned 16, Elizabeth was appointed colonel of the Grenadier Guards, her first military appointment. She began to take a more active part in public engagements, accompanying her parents on some of their visits and duties. As she approached adulthood, there was increasing discussion about her future role and the training she would need. One of the most significant developments in Elizabeth's later teenage years was her growing interest in the military and her determination to contribute directly to the war effort. In 1945, with victory in Europe finally achieved, the 18-year-old princess surprised many by asking her father's permission to join the Auxiliary Territorial Service, ATS, the women's branch of the British Army. The king agreed, and Elizabeth enrolled as second subaltern Elizabeth Windsor, service number 230,873. During her time in the ATS, Princess Elizabeth learned to drive and maintain military vehicles. She trained as a mechanic and driver, getting her hands dirty under the hoods of trucks and ambulances, learning to change wheels and understand engines. This practical experience gave her insights into a world far removed from palace life and brought her into contact with women from many different backgrounds, all serving their country together in a time of national crisis. Photographs from this period show the princess in her khaki uniform, her hair tucked neatly under a military cap, her hands blackened with grease as she worked on engine parts. These images captured the imagination of the British public, who saw in their future queen someone willing to step outside the traditional boundaries of royal life, to share in the common experience of service and sacrifice. As the war drew to its close, Elizabeth had grown from a sheltered child into a young woman with a strong sense of duty and service. The experiences of the war years had given her a deeper understanding of her future role and a connection with her future subjects that would have been impossible in peacetime. She had seen the monarchy adapt to meet the challenges of modern warfare, with her parents remaining in London during the Blitz and visiting bombed-out areas to offer comfort and support. These lessons in public service and resilience would shape her approach to monarchy in the decades to come. Throughout these formative years, one constant presence in Elizabeth's life was her father, King George VI, though he had never expected or wanted to be king. And though he struggled with a debilitating stammer that made public speaking an ordeal, he carried out his duties with quiet courage and dignity. From him, Elizabeth learned about dedication to duty and service, about putting the demands of the role above personal preference or comfort. These were lessons she would carry with her throughout her long life of service as peace returned to Europe and the world began the long process of rebuilding. Princess Elizabeth stood on the threshold of adulthood, her character shaped by the extraordinary circumstances of her childhood and youth. The shy little girl who had unexpectedly become heir to the throne had grown into a serious, dutiful young woman, prepared by education and experience for the responsibilities that lay ahead. Though she could not know how soon those responsibilities would come or how long she would carry them, she was ready to face whatever the future might bring, grounded in the values and experiences of her early years. Let us drift further into the story as we explore the next part of this fascinating journey. In the gentle mist of time, long before the crown rested upon her head, the story of Queen Elizabeth II began to unfold through the intertwining branches of a family tree deeply rooted in European history. Let us drift back through the corridors of time, allowing the soft whispers of history to carry us into a peaceful exploration of her ancestral tapestry. Born on April 21, 1926, Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor entered a world still recovering from the Great War. Her lineage, however, stretched far beyond the troubles of the modern era, flowing like a serene river through centuries of British and European history. The House of Windsor, the royal house to which she belonged, was relatively young in name, having been established in 1917 when her grandfather, King George V, changed the family name from the German-sounding Saxe-Coburg and Gotha during the First World War. Yet beneath this recent renaming lay centuries of royal connections that spread across the continent like the gentle tendrils of morning mist. Elizabeth's paternal grandfather, King George V, was the grandson of Queen Victoria, that most enduring symbol of British imperial might and domestic virtue. Victoria herself represented the joining of two great royal houses, the Hanoverians, who had ruled Britain since 1714, and and the German house of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, through her beloved husband, Prince Albert, through Victoria, Elizabeth could trace her ancestry back to the medieval kings of England, to William the Conqueror, who crossed the Channel in 1066, and even further to the ancient Saxon kings who ruled before the Norman conquest. Imagine, if you will, the gentle flow of blood through generations, carrying stories and traits from one century to the next. Elizabeth inherited not just titles and lands, but also the quiet resilience of ancestors who had weathered civil wars, revolutions, and the gradual transformation of absolute monarchy into constitutional rule. This heritage of adaptation would serve her well throughout her long reign. On her mother's side, Elizabeth's roots reached deep into the soil of Scotland. Her mother, born Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, came from an ancient Scottish noble family. The Bowes-Lyon family had served the Scottish and later British crowns for generations. Their history, intertwined with the misty highlands and the stone castles that dotted the Scottish landscape, they brought to Elizabeth a connection to the Celtic traditions of Scotland, to the clan system, with its emphasis on family loyalty and honor. The young Elizabeth grew up hearing tales of Scottish ancestors who had fought in ancient clan battles, who had served Mary, Queen of Scots, and who had maintained their lands through turbulent times. Her maternal grandfather, the Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, presided over Glamis Castle, a place steeped in legend and lore, said to be one of the most haunted castles in Britain. Within those ancient walls, young Elizabeth would have absorbed the weight of history, the importance of tradition, and the special connection between the land and those who were born to serve it. Family traditions shaped Elizabeth's early years, creating a rhythm to life that provided comfort and stability, even as the world around her changed dramatically. The royal calendar was marked by annual migrations. Summers at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, where the family could escape the formality of court life and enjoy the simple pleasures of country living. There, Elizabeth learned to ride horses, to appreciate the natural world, and to understand the lives of the people who worked the land. Christmas was spent at Sandringham House in Norfolk, where German traditions introduced by Prince Albert still influenced the celebrations. Gifts exchanged on Christmas Eve rather than Christmas morning. Festive trees decorated with candles, and family gatherings that emphasized togetherness over pomp and circumstance. Within this framework of tradition, Elizabeth's parents created a surprisingly normal childhood for their daughters. The family's private apartments at the various royal residences were places of genuine warmth and affection. King George VI, known to his family as Bertie, was a devoted father who made time for his daughters despite the pressing demands of kingship. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother as she would later be known, brought to the family her natural charm and her deep understanding of the importance of family bonds in creating resilient individuals. The sisters, Elizabeth and Margaret Rose, shared a nursery and a governess, learning together the lessons that would prepare them for their future roles. They put on pantomimes at Christmas, kept pets, learned to sew and cook, and enjoyed the simple games of childhood. Yet always there was an awareness, particularly for Elizabeth as the heir presumptive, that they were not quite like other children, that additional responsibilities and expectations would shape their lives. This sense of difference became more pronounced when Elizabeth's grandfather died in 1936, and her uncle, Edward VII, ascended the throne only to abdicate less than a year later to marry the woman he loved, the American divorcee, Wallis Simpson. Suddenly, Elizabeth's father was king, and she was next in line. The shy, stammering Duke of York had never expected or wanted the crown, but he accepted it out of a deep sense of duty, a quality he would pass on to his elder daughter as the shadows of the Second World War gathered over Europe. Elizabeth's adolescence was shaped by the experience of national crisis. Unlike many children of privilege who were sent abroad to safety, the princesses remained in England throughout the war. Though they spent much of their time at Windsor Castle rather than in London, Elizabeth watched as her parents became symbols of national resistance, refusing to leave London during the Blitz and visiting bombed areas to offer comfort to those who had lost homes and loved ones. The war years accelerated Elizabeth's entry into public life. At 14, she made her first radio broadcast, addressing other children who had been evacuated from their homes. By 16, she had been appointed Colonel-in-Chief of the Grenadier Guards. At 18, she joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, training as a driver and mechanic. The only female member of the royal family to serve in the armed forces. Through these experiences, the values that would guide her throughout her long life were reinforced and deepened. From her father, she absorbed the lesson that duty must come before personal desire. From her mother, she learned the importance of maintaining a public face of calm and optimism, even in the darkest times. From both parents, she inherited a deep Christian faith that provided a moral framework for decision-making and a source of personal strength. The cultural context of Elizabeth's formative years was one of empire in transition. Born when the British Empire was still at its territorial height, she grew up as that empire began its transformation into the Commonwealth of Nations. The concept of service that was so central to her understanding of monarchy extended to these diverse nations and peoples connected by history and choice to the British crown. Within her own family, Elizabeth was the keeper of traditions, the one who remembered birthdays and anniversaries, who maintained connections with distant cousins across Europe's royal houses. Many of these royal relatives were descendants, like her, of Queen Victoria, whose children had married into the royal families of Germany, Russia, Spain, and other European nations. This network of family connections gave Elizabeth a perspective on European affairs that was both personal and political. When peace returned to Europe in 1945, Elizabeth was a young woman of 19, already carrying significant public responsibilities and deeply shaped by the experiences of war. It was during the war years that she had met the young naval officer who would become her husband, Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark. Philip himself represented another branch of European royalty, being a descendant of both Queen Victoria and of the Danish and Greek royal houses. Their marriage in 1947 brought together different royal traditions. Philip, raised partly in Britain, but born into the Greek royal family, brought a more cosmopolitan perspective to match Elizabeth's deeply British outlook. His own family history was marked by exile and loss. His family had been forced to flee Greece when he was an infant, and he had grown up without a stable family home, shuttled between relatives and boarding schools. This gave him a resilience and adaptability that would complement Elizabeth's more rooted sense of duty and tradition. As a young married couple, Elizabeth and Philip began to establish their own family traditions, blending elements from both their backgrounds. Philip's influence could be seen in the more informal education chosen for their children compared to royal precedent, and in the family's private enjoyment of outdoor activities and sports. Elizabeth's contribution was the emphasis on duty and service, on understanding the responsibilities that came with privilege. The early years of their marriage were spent partly in Malta, where Philip was stationed with the Royal Navy. This period represented perhaps the closest Elizabeth would ever come to the life of an ordinary naval wife, living in a villa rather than a palace, entertaining friends, and enjoying a degree of freedom that would become impossible once she ascended the throne. That moment came sooner than expected. In February 1952, while Elizabeth and Philip were representing the king on a tour of Kenya, news came that King George VI had died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 25. Elizabeth became Queen of the United Kingdom and head of the Commonwealth, inheriting a role for which she had been preparing all her life, but which came to her sooner than anyone had anticipated. The young queen brought to her new role a deep sense of history and continuity. She was now the latest in a long line of British monarchs stretching back over 1,000 years. The coronation ceremony, in which she participated in June 1953, contained elements that would have been recognizable to medieval kings, symbols and rituals that connected her reign to those that had come before. Yet Elizabeth also recognized that she ruled in a new era. Her coronation was the first to be televised, bringing the ancient ceremony into the living rooms of people across Britain and around the world. Throughout her reign, she would continue this balancing act, maintaining the traditions and dignity of the monarchy, while allowing it to evolve to meet the needs and expectations of a changing society. The family into which Elizabeth was born, and the family she created with Philip, formed the emotional core of her life, even as her public duties expanded to fill her days. The values she had absorbed in childhood, duty, service, resilience, faith, remained her guiding principles throughout the decades of her reign. The traditions she had inherited, some centuries old, others more recent creations, provided structure and meaning to the rhythm of royal life. As night gently falls and these words drift around you, imagine the tapestry of Elizabeth's family history as a warm, comforting blanket of stories and connections, stretching back through the generations. Each thread represents a person, a tradition, a value passed down through time. Together, they created the remarkable woman who would become Britain's longest reigning monarch, a constant presence through decades of change, a link between the past and the future. As you drift toward sleep, let the gentle flow of history carry you into dreams, perhaps of castles and crowns, of family gatherings in grand halls, of a young princess becoming a queen, carrying with her always the rich heritage of those who came before. The peaceful narrative of this life continues as we turn our attention to what happened next. In the quiet spring of 1926, a little girl named Elizabeth Alexandra Mary was born into a world of gentle privilege, though not one initially destined for the crown. The soft morning light of April 21st filtered through the windows of 17 Bruton Street in London's Mayfair district, a townhouse belonging to her maternal grandparents, the Earl and Countess of Strathmore. This elegant Georgian building stood in a neighborhood of distinguished calm, where the clip-clop of horses still mingled with the occasional purr of early motor cars passing over cobblestone streets. The London into which little Elizabeth arrived was a city recovering from the Great War, its streets and squares carrying both the weight of recent history and the hopeful energy of the mid-1920s. The air held a mixture of coal smoke and morning fog, creating those famous London mists that softened the edges of buildings and wrapped around street lamps like gentle halos. In Mayfair, the sounds of the broader city were muffled. A distant church bell, perhaps, or the calls of street vendors several blocks away, but never intruding too forcefully into the dignified quiet of this aristocratic enclave. Elizabeth's earliest days were spent in this London townhouse, surrounded by soft wool blankets and attended by nannies who moved with quiet efficiency through rooms furnished with antiques and family portraits. The nursery walls were painted in soothing pastels, and the windows looked out onto a small but impeccably maintained garden where, on pleasant days, the baby might be taken for fresh air in her pram, sheltered from curious eyes by the high garden walls. But London was not to be Elizabeth's primary childhood home. When she was just a few months old, her parents, the Duke and Countess of York, moved to a more spacious residence at 145 Piccadilly, near Hyde Park. This substantial townhouse became the backdrop for Elizabeth's earliest memories. A world of high ceilings and polished banisters, of nursery tea times and bedtime stories read by her mother in the soft glow of table lamps. The rhythm of life at 145 Piccadilly followed the gentle cadence of aristocratic London. Mornings might begin with the distant sounds of servants moving about downstairs, preparing the house for the day. That the house itself was substantial, but not ostentatious, a home rather than a palace. Its rooms held comfortable furniture arranged for conversation, and family gatherings rather than for state occasions. In the nursery, shelves were filled with carefully selected toys. A rocking horse with a real horsehair mane, soft stuffed animals, and dolls dressed in miniature versions of the fashionable clothes worn by Elizabeth's mother. The gardens of the house, though modest by royal standards, offered Elizabeth her first encounters with the natural world. The miracle of spring bulbs pushing through the soil, the gentle buzzing of bees among the flowers in summer, the crisp rustle of autumn leaves. Here, under the watchful eyes of her nanny, she would take her first tottering steps on the garden paths, reaching out to touch the velvety petals of roses, or watch with wide-eyed wonder as birds hopped about on the lawn. Beyond the garden walls stretched Hyde Park, where Elizabeth was sometimes taken for walks. The park offered a more expansive connection to nature, grand old trees whose branches swayed in the breeze, expanses of grass where dogs ran and children played, the serpentine lake where ducks created ripples across the surface of the water. These outings were carefully timed and planned, for even as a small child, Elizabeth attracted attention. Her golden curls and serious expression drawing smiles and sometimes small crowds. The changing seasons in London brought their own sensory experiences. The cool, damp days of autumn, when fog rolled through the streets, the occasional snowfall that transformed familiar landscapes into magical white wonderlands, the first tentative warmth of spring that brought green shoots and birdsong back to the parks. Elizabeth experienced all of these from the sheltered vantage point of privilege, but they nonetheless formed her understanding of the natural rhythms of the world. When Elizabeth was 4 years old, her parents added to their family with the birth of her sister Margaret Rose. The nursery at 145 Piccadilly was rearranged to accommodate this new arrival, and Elizabeth found herself in the role of elder sister, a position she approached with characteristic seriousness and care. The relationship between the two sisters would become one of the defining elements of Elizabeth's emotional landscape. Margaret, with her vivacity and impulsiveness, providing a counterpoint to Elizabeth's more measured temperament. The social environment of Elizabeth's early childhood was carefully controlled and remarkably small for a child of her position. Her primary companions were her parents, her sister, her nannies, and occasionally the children of family friends or royal relatives who might be invited to play. Unlike children of less exalted backgrounds, Elizabeth did not attend school, instead receiving instruction from a governess within the quiet confines of home. Her days followed a consistent schedule: lessons in the morning, perhaps a walk in the afternoon, tea time with her parents when their schedules permitted, bath time and stories before bed. This sheltered existence was disrupted in 1936, when Elizabeth was 10 years old, by events that would fundamentally alter the course of her life. Her uncle, King Edward VII, abdicated the throne to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. Suddenly, Elizabeth's father became King George VI, and she herself became heir presumptive to the British throne. The family moved from their comfortable home at 145 Piccadilly to the much grander and more formal surroundings of Buckingham Palace. Buckingham Palace presented an entirely different physical environment, a building designed for ceremony and state business as much as for family life. The scale alone was overwhelming. 775 rooms spread over 828,000 square feet, with corridors so long that staff sometimes used bicycles to traverse them. The ceilings soared overhead, decorated with ornate plasterwork and crystal chandeliers. Paintings by old masters hung on walls covered in silk damask. Furniture that had belonged to kings and queens of previous centuries stood on polished parquet floors, or thick carpets bearing royal crests. The sounds of this new home were different too. The echo of footsteps on marble floors, the distant ring of official telephones, the occasional ceremonial music drifting up from the courtyard during the changing of the guard. Even the quality of light changed, filtered as it was through taller windows, often partially covered by heavy drapes to protect the priceless furnishings from sun damage. Yet, within this grand setting, Elizabeth's parents worked to create spaces of normality and family warmth. The private apartments were furnished more comfortably than the state rooms, with photographs in silver frames, favorite books on shelves, and personal mementos collected over the years. Here, in the evenings, the family might gather to listen to the wireless, play games, or simply talk about their day, creating islands of ordinary family life within the extraordinary setting of a palace. Beyond London, another important physical environment shaped Elizabeth's childhood: Royal Lodge at Windsor, and later Windsor Castle itself, which became the family's primary residence during World War II. Windsor offered a different sensory landscape. The ancient stone walls of the castle, the vast expanse of Windsor Great Park, with its magnificent old oak trees, the sound of the River Thames flowing nearby. At Windsor, Elizabeth experienced a greater freedom of movement than was possible in London. She could ride her pony through the park's paths, feeling the rhythm of hoofbeats on soft earth and the wind in her hair. She could explore the castle's many rooms and corridors, each with its own history and character. The smell of wood smoke from fireplaces in winter, the fragrance of flowers from the castle gardens in summer, the distinctive scent of the stables where her beloved horses were kept. All these became part of her sensory memory. The social environment at Windsor expanded somewhat as well. During the war years, Elizabeth and Margaret participated in pantomimes performed for castle staff and convalescing soldiers. Elizabeth joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service in 1945, training as a driver and mechanic, which brought her into contact with young women from backgrounds very different from her own. These experiences, though still carefully managed, offered glimpses into lives and perspectives beyond the royal circle. Throughout these changing physical environments, certain constants remained in Elizabeth's life. There was the unwavering presence of her parents, particularly her father, whose sense of duty and service, despite his reluctance to take the throne and his struggle with a speech impediment, provided a powerful example. There was the steady influence of her governess, Marion Crawford, known as Crawfie, who brought structure and intellectual stimulation to her days. And there were the rituals and routines of royal life, the formal dinners, the church services, the seasonal movements between residences that provided a framework for the passing years. The physical spaces of Elizabeth's childhood were always shared with history. She grew up among furniture that had belonged to previous monarchs, played in gardens designed by renowned landscape architects of previous centuries, and learned to navigate rooms where momentous decisions had been made. This constant presence of the past perhaps contributed to her deep sense of continuity and tradition. Her understanding of herself as part of a long line stretching back through time. As evening shadows lengthened across these childhood landscapes, Elizabeth would retire to bedrooms that changed as she grew, and as the family moved between residences. From the nursery at 145 Piccadilly, with its cheerful wallpaper and carefully chosen toys, to grander chambers at Buckingham Palace, to rooms at Windsor Castle with views across the ancient parkland, the bedtime rituals remained consistent. The bath, the prayers, the story read in the gentle glow of a bedside lamp, the soft kiss goodnight, and as she drifted toward sleep, just as you might be doing now, the sounds of her childhood homes would gradually fade. The distant closing of doors, the muffled footsteps of staff completing their evening duties, perhaps the faint ticking of a clock, or the occasional creak of an old building settling for the night. Outside, London might still pulse with activity, or Windsor might lie quiet under a canopy of stars. But within her protected world, night brought a peaceful pause, a time for dreams that might or might not have included the future that awaited her. Decades of service as queen, the weight of a crown, the eyes of the world watching her every move, the physical and social environments of Elizabeth's childhood, the elegant restraint of 145 Piccadilly, the grandeur of Buckingham Palace, the historic weight of Windsor Castle, the carefully chosen companions, the structured days, all contributed to shaping the woman she would become. They taught her dignity and discretion, gave her an appreciation for tradition alongside an understanding of duty, and instilled in her the quiet strength that would sustain her through the longest reign in British history. As you relax deeper, let us now softly explore the next chapter of this soothing biography. As the golden light of childhood gave way to the more measured illumination of formal education, young Elizabeth's intellectual world began to expand in ways both expected and surprising. Unlike other children of Britain's aristocracy, Elizabeth was never sent away to boarding school. Instead, her education came to her, arriving each morning in the form of a governess named Marian Crawford, affectionately called Crawfie by the young princesses. Crawfie would gently guide Elizabeth through her daily lessons in a small, sunlit classroom set up within the palace walls, where the tick of the clock on the mantelpiece marked the passing hours of study. The mornings would typically begin with Elizabeth at her desk, her fair hair neatly brushed, her posture already showing signs of the composure that would become her hallmark in later years. Crawfie would start with the fundamentals: reading, writing, arithmetic, teaching with a patient persistence that matched her young pupil's methodical mind. Elizabeth showed an early aptitude for order and structure, taking comfort in the predictable progression of her lessons, much as you might find comfort now in the steady rhythm of these words as they carry you toward restful sleep. History lessons held a special place in the curriculum, with particular emphasis on the constitutional history of Great Britain. As Elizabeth's eyelids grew heavy with concentration, Crawfie would weave tales of monarchs past, their triumphs and failures, their duties and privileges. The young princess absorbed these stories not merely as interesting anecdotes, but as family history, as precedents that might one day guide her own actions. She learned of Queen Victoria's long reign, of her great-grandfather Edward VII's diplomatic skills, of her grandfather George V's steadfast leadership during the First World War. Languages came next, with French being a particular focus. Elizabeth's pronunciation developed with a careful precision, each syllable formed with thoughtful attention. German lessons were also part of her education, though these would become less emphasized as European tensions mounted in the years leading up to the Second World War. The gentle cadence of foreign vocabulary, repeated and practiced until mastered, filled those quiet morning hours in the palace schoolroom. Religious instruction held an important place in Elizabeth's education, laying the groundwork for what would become a deep and abiding faith. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself occasionally visited to guide her understanding of the Church of England, explaining with measured words the role she might one day play as its supreme governor. These lessons in faith were delivered not with fire and brimstone, but with the quiet certainty of tradition, much like the soft assurance of a bedtime prayer. As the afternoon sun cast long, warm rectangles of light across the schoolroom floor, Elizabeth would turn to subjects that brought her particular joy. Music lessons saw her small fingers moving across piano keys, learning the discipline of practice and the satisfaction of mastery. She showed a natural ear for melody and rhythm, though she pursued music not with the passion of an artist, but with the diligence of a good student, understanding its place in a well-rounded education. When Elizabeth turned 13, her parents recognized the need to supplement Crawfy's teaching with more specialized instruction. Sir Henry Martin, the vice provost of Eton College, began visiting the palace once a week to provide lessons in constitutional history and law. Picture the scene: the distinguished scholar with his white hair and formal attire, sitting across from the earnest young princess in a book-lined study, the only sounds being the occasional turning of a page or the scratch of a pen on paper. As Elizabeth took careful notes, Sir Henry's approach was conversational rather than didactic, drawing Elizabeth into discussions about the delicate balance of powers in Britain's constitutional monarchy. He would pose questions about historical situations, encouraging her to consider how past sovereigns had navigated their constitutional roles. These lessons, delivered in Sir Henry's gentle, scholarly voice, planted seeds of understanding that would later blossom into Elizabeth's nuanced grasp of her constitutional position. A position with great symbolic power, but carefully prescribed political limits. Unlike her education in academic subjects, Elizabeth's preparation for her future role came not through formal lessons, but through observation and gradual immersion. She would sit quietly in the corner of her father's study as he reviewed state papers, absorbing the rhythm and routine of royal duties. On ceremonial occasions, she watched her parents perform their public roles, noting the blend of dignity and warmth they brought to each interaction. These unspoken lessons in royal deportment were perhaps the most valuable part of her education, teaching her things no textbook could convey. As Elizabeth's teenage years unfolded, World War II cast its long shadow across Britain and across her education. The princesses were evacuated to Windsor Castle for safety, where their schoolroom was relocated to a cozy room overlooking the ancient castle grounds. The distant rumble of war sometimes interrupted their studies, but Crawfy maintained the structure and routine that had always characterized Elizabeth's education, providing a sense of normalcy amid global chaos. During these war years, Elizabeth's education expanded to include practical skills that reflected the national mood of service and sacrifice. She learned first aid, studied aircraft recognition, and eventually joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, where she trained as a driver and mechanic. Picture her in overalls, her hands learning the feel of tools, her mind grasping the practical workings of engines. A far cry from the constitutional theory of Sir Henry's lessons, but equally valuable in shaping her understanding of the world and its workings throughout these formative years. Elizabeth had access to the palace libraries, with their shelves of leather-bound volumes reaching toward ornate ceilings. She developed a particular fondness for historical biographies, spending quiet evenings lost in the lives of those who had come before her. Her reading was not that of a scholar or intellectual, but of a person seeking practical wisdom and precedent, always with an eye toward application rather than theory. Elizabeth's formal education concluded earlier than might have been expected for someone of her intelligence and position. By the age of 17, her structured lessons had largely given way to practical preparation for royal duties. There were no university studies, no grand tour of Europe, as had been traditional for aristocratic youth in earlier generations. Instead, she began to accompany her parents on official engagements, learning through participation the art of conversation with strangers, the protocol of public events, the stamina required for long days of ceremonial duties. Yet it would be a mistake to think that Elizabeth's intellectual development ended with her formal education. Throughout her life, she maintained a curious mind and a desire to understand the changing world around her. Her morning routine always included a thorough reading of the newspapers, and she received regular briefings from experts in various fields. Her questions were known to be precise and insightful, cutting to the heart of complex matters with a clarity that sometimes surprised those who underestimated her intelligence. The formation of Elizabeth's character during these educational years revealed a person of remarkable consistency. The same qualities that Croffy had noted in her young pupil, conscientiousness, thoroughness, a preference for order and method, remained evident throughout her long life. She approached her role not as an intellectual exercise, but as a practical responsibility, bringing to it the same careful attention she had once brought to her lessons in that sunlit palace schoolroom. Her intellectual development was shaped not by revolutionary ideas or philosophical explorations, but by a deep understanding of tradition and continuity. She absorbed the lessons of history not as academic knowledge, but as living guidance, seeing herself as one link in a long chain stretching back through centuries and forward into an unknowable future. This perspective gave her a remarkable steadiness, a quality that would come to define her reign. As the years passed and Elizabeth moved from princess to queen, from student to sovereign, the habits formed during those educational years remained with her. The methodical approach to paperwork, the careful preparation before public appearances, the attentive listening during briefings. All these reflected the disciplined student she had once been. Even her famous red boxes of government papers, which she reviewed diligently each day of her reign, echoed the homework assignments once completed under Croffy's watchful eye. Perhaps the most significant aspect of Elizabeth's intellectual development was her understanding of discretion. From her earliest lessons, she grasped that her position required a careful guardianship of thoughts and opinions. This was not merely about maintaining political neutrality, though that would become crucial in her constitutional role. It was also about the dignified reserve that had characterized the monarchy since her grandfather's time, a quality that allowed people to project onto the sovereign their own hopes and values. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine young Elizabeth in those formative moments of learning, her brow furrowed in concentration as she masters a difficult French verb, her eyes widening as Sir Henry explains some nuance of constitutional precedent, her hands carefully turning the pages of a history book as the afternoon light fades, and a palace servant quietly enters to light the lamps. In these ordinary moments of education, the extraordinary reign to come was being shaped, one lesson at a time. The education of Elizabeth II was not designed to produce an intellectual or an innovator, but to nurture a reliable custodian of tradition, someone who would maintain the delicate balance of a modern constitutional monarchy with both dignity and humanity. In this, it succeeded beyond what anyone might have imagined during those early lessons in the palace schoolroom. The longest-serving monarch in British history carried with her always the lessons of those formative years. Lessons in duty, in discretion, in the careful stewardship of inherited institutions. And so, as your thoughts grow gentler and your breathing deepens toward sleep, consider how Elizabeth's education, both formal and informal, prepared her not just with knowledge, but with the character to use that knowledge wisely. The patient student became the patient queen, applying to the complexities of her role the same methodical attention she had once given to her lessons. In this continuity between learning and application, between preparation and performance, lies perhaps the truest measure of her education's success. Our soothing biography continues with a look at the next important period in this incredible life. As you settle deeper into the quiet of the evening, let your mind drift back to the figures who gently shaped the life of a young princess, their words and wisdom weaving themselves into the fabric of her character. The story of Elizabeth II is not just one of solitary duty, but of relationships that guided, challenged, and comforted her across the decades. One of the earliest and most enduring influences in her life was her father, King George VI. Though he had never expected to be king, his quiet strength in the face of adversity became a defining example for his daughter. She watched as he overcame his struggle with a stammer, delivering wartime speeches that steadied a nation. He taught her not through lectures, but through example, his sense of duty, his devotion to family, his unwavering presence. When he passed too soon, she carried his lessons forward, stepping into the role he had once shouldered with such quiet dignity. Then there was her mother, the Queen Mother, whose warmth and charm softened the rigors of royal life. She instilled in Elizabeth a sense of grace under pressure, an ability to make even the most formal encounters feel personal. The Queen Mother's knack for putting people at ease, whether a nervous dignitary or a child presenting flowers, left a lasting impression. She also taught Elizabeth the value of resilience. Having lived through 2 world wars and the abdication crisis that thrust her husband onto the throne, among her formal educators, none was more influential than Sir Henry Martin, the vice provost of Eton College, who took on the task of tutoring Elizabeth in constitutional history. His lessons were not dry recitations of facts, but lively discussions about the delicate balance between crown and government. He encouraged her to think deeply about the role of the monarchy, to understand its history not as a relic, but as a living institution. She would later recall his habit of pacing the room, hands clasped behind his back, as he explained the nuances of parliamentary procedure. His teachings became the foundation upon which she built her understanding of kingship. Another guiding figure was Marion Crawford, affectionately known as Crawfie, Elizabeth's governess during her childhood. Crawfie brought a sense of normalcy to the young princess's life, arranging picnics in the palace gardens, taking her and Margaret to pantomimes, and even letting them mingle, briefly, with ordinary children on the streets of London during the war, though their relationship later became strained. Crawfie's early influence helped Elizabeth develop a grounded perspective, a sense that duty did not have to mean distance from the people she served. As Elizabeth grew, so too did the circle of mentors around her. Winston Churchill, her first prime minister, became both a statesman and a fatherly figure. Their weekly meetings were meant to be formal affairs, but over time, they developed a mutual respect that bordered on affection. He admired her steadiness, and she valued his wisdom, drawn from a lifetime of leadership. He once told her that the secret to ruling was not just in knowing the rules, but in knowing when to bend them. Advice she would remember long after his time in office had ended. Her husband, Prince Philip, was perhaps her most constant companion and confidant. Though their marriage had its challenges, his unwavering support allowed her to balance the demands of the crown with the needs of her family. He was her sounding board, her challenger, and her comfort. His practical nature balanced her more reserved temperament, and his willingness to modernize aspects of the monarchy helped her navigate the changing times. Beyond these personal relationships, Elizabeth also drew inspiration from historical figures. She often spoke of her admiration for Queen Victoria, not just for the length of her reign, but for the way she adapted to an era of profound change. Like Victoria, Elizabeth understood that tradition and progress were not opposites, but partners in the long life of an institution. And then there were the quiet influences, the stable hands who taught her to love horses, the clergy who deepened her faith, the servants who, in small, unrecorded moments reminded her of the humanity behind the crown. Each of these relationships left its mark, shaping a queen who could be both regal and relatable, steadfast and adaptable. As sleep draws nearer, picture these figures moving through the halls of memory, their voices soft, but their presence enduring. Their lessons were not just about ruling, but about living, about how to carry responsibility with grace, how to lead with kindness, how to remain oneself even beneath the weight of history. And so, in the quiet of the night, their influence lingers, just as it did throughout the long and remarkable reign of Elizabeth II. Let your mind float with these gentle recollections as we move forward in our story. The early years of Elizabeth's public life unfolded like the slow, steady turning of pages in an old book, each chapter revealing a little more of the quiet determination that would one day define her reign. Though she was still a young princess, the weight of her future role was never far from her mind. Her first steps into duty were taken with care, guided by the steady hands of those who understood both the privilege and the burden of royal service. It was during the dark days of the Second World War that Elizabeth made her first official contributions to public life. The war had reshaped the world, and even the royal family was not untouched by its demands. At just 14 years old, she delivered her first radio address to the children of Britain, her voice soft but steady, offering comfort in a time of fear. She spoke of courage, of hope, and of the enduring spirit of home, a message written with the help of her mother, who understood the power of words to soothe a nation. As the war raged on, Elizabeth's role grew. At 18, she insisted on joining the Auxiliary Territorial Service, determined to serve her country in a tangible way. There, she learned to drive and repair military vehicles, working alongside young women from all walks of life. For the first time, she experienced the rhythms of ordinary work, rising early, following orders, sharing in the camaraderie of a shared cause. The oil-stained overalls, the scent of engine grease, the laughter in the barracks. These were small but profound moments that stayed with her, reminders that duty was not just about ceremony, but about rolling up one's sleeves and doing what was needed. When peace finally came, Elizabeth stepped further into the public eye. She accompanied her parents on tour, absorbing the delicate art of diplomacy. How to listen as much as speak, how to find the right words for each occasion, how to make even the briefest encounter feel meaningful. On a visit to South Africa in 1947, she celebrated her 21st birthday with a speech that would echo through the years. It was a promise made in the bloom of youth, but one she would honor with every passing decade. The following year brought her marriage to Philip, a partnership that would anchor her through the many transitions ahead. Together, they navigated the early challenges of public life, learning to balance private happiness with public expectation, to find moments of quiet in the relentless pace of royal duties. Philip, with his sharp wit and unwavering support, became both her confidant and her compass, steadying her as she took on more responsibility. Then, in 1952, the unthinkable happened. While on tour in Kenya, news reached her that her father, King George VI, had passed away. The weight of the crown fell upon her shoulders in an instant, and with it, the realization that her life would never be the same. The young princess, who had once mended trucks and made radio broadcasts, was now queen, inheriting not just a title, but a nation still healing from war, an empire in transition, a world on the brink of a new age. Her coronation in 1953 was a spectacle of tradition, a ceremony steeped in centuries of ritual. Yet, beneath the golden robes and jeweled crown was a woman deeply aware of the modern world she was being called to lead. She understood that the monarchy could not remain untouched by change, that to endure, it must adapt without losing its essence. With quiet resolve, she set about reshaping the institution, making it more accessible, more connected to the people it served. Those early years of her reign were not without difficulty. The Suez Crisis tested her diplomatic instincts. The fading of the British Empire demanded careful navigation, and the relentless scrutiny of the press required a new kind of resilience. But through it all, she remained steady, guided by the lessons of her youth, the importance of duty, the value of quiet perseverance, the understanding that leadership was not about grand gestures, but about consistency, about showing up day after day, year after year. And so, as the years unfolded, Elizabeth's early experiences, the war, the service, the sudden ascent to the throne, became the foundation of a reign unlike any other. The princess, who had once spoken of devotion, would go on to embody it in ways both large and small, until her presence itself became a kind of quiet reassurance, a constant in a changing world. Now, as the night deepens and the mind grows soft with sleep, imagine her in those early days, a young woman stepping into history, not with fanfare, but with quiet resolve. Picture her hands learning the weight of duty, her voice finding its steadiness, her heart balancing the personal and the profound. And just as she carried those lessons forward, so too can you carry this quiet story into rest, letting it settle like the gentle closing of a book, ready to be opened again when morning comes. Drifting like clouds across the evening sky, we now move to the next part of this calming life story. Over the decades, Queen Elizabeth II's reign unfolded like a tapestry, each thread carefully woven into the next, creating a portrait of steadfastness and quiet transformation. Her achievements were not marked by dramatic proclamations or sweeping revolutions, but by the steady accumulation of moments, small acts of duty, subtle shifts in tradition, and an unwavering commitment to service. She understood that the monarchy's endurance depended not on resisting change, but on adapting to it, guiding it with a gentle hand and a measured heart. One of her most profound contributions was the evolution of the Commonwealth. When she inherited the throne, the British Empire was already dissolving, its territories seeking independence. But where others might have seen loss, Elizabeth saw possibility. She nurtured the Commonwealth into a voluntary association of nations, bound not by obligation, but by shared values and mutual respect. She traveled tirelessly more than any monarch before her, visiting distant shores, listening to local leaders, and fostering connections that transcended politics. Her presence at these gatherings was never domineering, but reassuring, a reminder that history could be honored even as new paths were forged. In her quiet way, she helped redefine what it meant to be a global leader, not through force, but through constancy and care. At home, her reign saw the monarchy grow more accessible, though never less dignified. She was the first British monarch to allow television cameras into the sacred space of her coronation, understanding that the people who celebrated her should also be able to witness the ceremony. It was a delicate balance, maintaining the mystique of the crown while acknowledging the modern world's desire for transparency. Over the years, she permitted glimpses into her life, the Christmas broadcasts, the documentary films, the carefully curated moments that humanized her without diminishing her role. She never overshared, never sought the spotlight for its own sake, but she allowed just enough light in to keep the monarchy relevant in an age of rapid change. Her diplomatic touch was another hallmark of her reign. She met with presidents, prime ministers, and popes, each encounter marked by the same quiet grace. She understood the power of subtlety, a well-timed smile, a carefully chosen word, the ability to listen more than she spoke. During times of tension, her presence often served as a calming force, a neutral ground where difficult conversations could begin. She was not a political figure, yet her influence was profound, built on decades of trust and the unspoken understanding that she represented something larger than any single issue. Perhaps one of her most defining qualities was her ability to modernize without erasing tradition. She approved small but significant changes, allowing her sister to marry a divorced man, welcoming Diana's more emotional approach to royal duties, and later supporting William and Kate's more relatable style of engagement. She knew that the monarchy had to breathe, to bend slightly with the times, but she also knew that its strength lay in its continuity. Every adjustment was measured, deliberate, never rushed. She was like a gardener tending to an ancient tree, pruning just enough to ensure its survival, but never so much that it lost its essence. Her dedication to service was another thread that ran through her life. Even in her later years, she maintained a rigorous schedule of public engagements, often standing for hours in all weathers, listening to countless voices, shaking innumerable hands. She did not complain, did not seek shortcuts. To her, duty was not a burden, but a privilege, a promise made long ago and kept every day. The organizations she supported, the charities she championed, the causes she elevated, all were chosen with care, reflecting her belief that leadership was not about power, but about responsibility. And then there were the small moments, the ones that never made headlines, but lingered in memory. The way she could put a nervous guest at ease with a question about their family, the warmth in her eyes when meeting children, the quiet humor that occasionally surfaced in her speeches. These were the touches that made her reign feel personal, even as it spanned continents and generations. She was not a distant figure on a throne, but a woman who understood the weight of symbols, the crown, the scepter, the wave from a balcony, and carried them with reverence. As the years passed, her presence became a kind of anchor in a turbulent world. Through wars and recessions, through scandals and celebrations, she remained. Her voice, steady and familiar, was a reassurance in times of crisis. Her Christmas broadcasts, delivered with quiet sincerity, became a ritual for millions, a moment of reflection in the rush of the season. She did not need to raise her voice to be heard. Her consistency was her eloquence. And so, as you drift toward sleep, let these images linger softly in your mind. The Queen walking among crowds, her gloved hand lifted in greeting. The Queen at her desk, reviewing papers with the same diligence she had shown as a young woman. The Queen in the gardens of Windsor, a place she loved, where the weight of the world could be set aside for a moment. Her life was not one of grand gestures, but of countless small ones, each a stitch in the fabric of history. And just as she found strength in continuity, so too can you find rest in the quiet rhythm of her story, a story that whispers of duty, of grace, of time unfolding as it should. Sleep now, and let the steady beat of history carry you into dreams. As your breathing becomes more regular, let us continue with the next chapter of our biography. The life of Queen Elizabeth II was not marked by sudden, dramatic upheavals, but rather by quiet turning points, moments when the course of history could have shifted, when her decisions rippled outward in ways no one could fully predict. These were the crossroads where duty, circumstance, and personal resolve met, shaping not just her reign, but the very nature of the monarchy she would steward for more than 7 decades. One such moment came when she was just a girl, barely 10 years old, when her uncle, King Edward VIII, made the fateful choice to abdicate the throne for love. In an instant, her father became King George VI, and her life transformed from that of a carefree princess to the heir presumptive. The weight of responsibility settled upon her small shoulders, though she carried it with a solemn grace beyond her years. Had Edward chosen differently, had he remained king, married a suitable bride, and produced heirs of his own, Elizabeth might have lived a quieter life, perhaps as a devoted wife and mother, free from the relentless scrutiny of the crown. But history had other plans. Instead, she grew up knowing the throne awaited her, and she prepared for it with quiet determination, absorbing lessons in duty that would define her reign. Then came the war years, when the royal family chose to remain in London despite the Blitz, sharing in the dangers faced by their people. Young Elizabeth, just 14 when the war began, insisted on contributing, first by broadcasting messages of hope to evacuated children, later by joining the Auxiliary Territorial Service as a mechanic, learning to repair engines and change tires. This decision to stand with her country rather than retreat to safety forged an unbreakable bond between the future queen and her subjects. It was a choice that set the tone for her reign, one of solidarity, of quiet service rather than lofty privilege. Had she and her family chosen exile, as some European royals had, the monarchy might have lost its place in the hearts of the British people, but they stayed, and in doing so, they became symbols of resilience. Another quiet turning point unfolded in 1947, when she married Prince Philip, a man whose strong personality and unwavering support would become her anchor. Their union was not without its challenges. Philip had to relinquish his naval career, adjust to life in the shadow of the throne, and navigate the stifling protocols of the palace. But together, they forged a partnership that endured. Some questioned whether a more politically advantageous match might have been made, perhaps with a European prince to strengthen alliances. But Elizabeth followed her heart, and in doing so, she secured not just a consort, but a lifelong companion who understood the weight she carried. Without him, her reign might have been lonelier, her burdens heavier. The most profound turning point, of course, was her father's death in 1952, cutting short his reign and thrusting Elizabeth, just 25 years old, onto the throne. She was in Kenya, on a tour meant to prepare her for the responsibilities ahead, when the news reached her. In that moment, she ceased to be simply Elizabeth and became queen. The transition was swift, the grief private, but her resolve never wavered. She returned to Britain, composed and steady, already embodying the quiet dignity that would become her hallmark. Had she faltered? Had she allowed her youth or sorrow to overwhelm her? The monarchy might have entered an uncertain era, but she did not. She stepped forward, accepting the crown with the same solemnity her father had shown. And in doing so, she assured the continuity of the institution she cherished. In the decades that followed, there were other moments when her choices quietly reshaped the monarchy. The decision to televise her coronation in 1953, against the advice of traditionalists, brought the ancient ceremony into the modern age, allowing millions to witness the splendor of the event. It was a small but significant step in making the monarchy more accessible, more a part of everyday life. Had she kept it shrouded in mystery, the crown might have felt more distant, less connected to the people it served. Then came the gradual evolution of the Commonwealth, a delicate balancing act between tradition and change, as former colonies sought independence. Elizabeth navigated these transitions with care, ensuring that the ties between nations remained even as their relationships transformed. Her decision to embrace this new role as head of a voluntary association of equals rather than an empire was pivotal. Had she resisted, had she clung to the old imperial model, the monarchy might have become irrelevant in a rapidly changing world. Instead, she adapted, and in doing so, preserved its relevance. The 1990s brought some of her greatest challenges: the breakdown of her children's marriages, the fire at Windsor Castle, the public outcry following Princess Diana's death. Each tested her instincts, her understanding of what the monarchy should be. Her initial reluctance to speak publicly after Diana's passing was criticized. Yet when she did address the nation, her words, though few, carried weight. She had misjudged the public mood, but she adjusted, showing that even a queen could learn, could bend without breaking. Had she remained silent, had she refused to acknowledge the grief of her people, the monarchy's bond with the public might have frayed beyond repair. But she listened, and in time she responded. And so, as you drift toward sleep, let these moments unfurl gently in your mind: each decision, each turning point, a quiet stitch in the tapestry of her reign. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping revolutions, just a woman doing her duty, one careful step at a time. She could have chosen differently at any point. She might have resisted change, or retreated from public life, or allowed personal sorrow to overshadow her role, but she did not. She remained, steady as the crown itself, adapting just enough to endure, holding fast to tradition while allowing the world to move forward around her. Her life was a lesson in constancy, in the power of small choices made with great care. And as you close your eyes, imagine her still sitting at her desk, walking among the roses at Windsor, lifting a hand in greeting to a crowd that loved her, each gesture, each moment, a quiet affirmation of duty fulfilled. Sleep now, and let the rhythm of her story, so steady, so sure, lull you into dreams as peaceful as her reign was long. The calming story continues as we gently examine what happened next in this remarkable journey. The relationships that shaped Queen Elizabeth II's life were woven together like threads in an intricate tapestry, some bright and joyful, others darker and more complex, but all essential to the whole. From the steadfast love of her husband to the bonds with her children, from trusted friends to the delicate dance of public alliances, each connection left its mark, quietly influencing the woman she became. At the heart of it all was Prince Philip, her constant companion for more than 7 decades. They met when she was just 13, a young princess with a quiet determination, and he a dashing naval cadet with a sharp wit. Their courtship unfolded in letters and stolen moments during the war years, a slow, steady blossoming of affection that defied the skepticism of some in the royal household. When they married in 1947, the austerity of post-war Britain made their wedding a modest affair by royal standards. But the warmth between them was unmistakable. Over the years, Philip became her anchor, blunt where she was diplomatic, restless where she was patient, but always, always by her side. He called her Lilibet, a childhood nickname that hinted at the private tenderness behind their public roles. There were tensions, of course, his occasional frustrations with the constraints of royal life, her unwavering commitment to duty, sometimes leaving little room for personal indulgence. Yet through every challenge, they found their rhythm, a partnership built on mutual respect and deep, unspoken understanding. Her children brought both joy and heartache. Charles, her firstborn, was a sensitive boy who grew into a man often at odds with the expectations placed upon him. Their relationship was complex, layered with love, but also the quiet strain of duty clashing with personal longing. She adored him, yet the weight of monarchy sometimes made it difficult to bridge the gap between sovereign and son. When his marriage to Diana unraveled so publicly, the Queen's instinct was to protect the institution, to keep private matters private, a stance that, for a time, left her seeming distant from the pain of both her son and the nation mourning Diana's loss. But in later years, as Charles found happiness with Camilla and shouldered more royal responsibilities, their bond deepened, softened by time and mutual devotion to service. Anne, her only daughter, mirrored Elizabeth's own practicality and no-nonsense approach to life. They shared a love of horses, of the quiet solitude of the countryside, and Anne's fierce independence was perhaps a reflection of the strength the Queen herself had needed in a male-dominated world. Andrew and Edward, her younger sons, brought different shades to her life. Andrew with his boldness, Edward with his quieter, more reflective nature. Each child, in their own way, taught her something about balancing love with duty, about the delicate art of letting go while still holding firm to what mattered most. Then there was Margaret, her younger sister, whose life was a study in contrasts. As children, they were inseparable, Margaret's vivacity complementing Elizabeth's steadiness. But where Elizabeth accepted the constraints of royalty with quiet resolve, Margaret chafed against them, her romances and rebellious streak making headlines. The Queen's refusal to allow Margaret to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend in the 1950s, a decision dictated by the strictures of the time, left a lingering sadness between them. Yet through the decades, through Margaret's struggles and declining health, the sisters remained connected by an unbreakable bond of childhood memories and shared loss, their love enduring even when words failed them. Beyond family, the Queen's friendships were few but deeply cherished. Her cousin, Lady Pamela Hicks, was a confidant from girlhood, someone who understood the unique pressures of her life without the filter of rank. The Queen Mother, her beloved mother, was a source of unwavering support until her death in 2002. Her warmth and humor, a counterbalance to the solemnity of the crown. And then there were her dogs, her corgis, constant, undemanding companions who offered a simplicity of affection that human relationships rarely could. Professionally, her relationships were marked by a careful balance of formality and subtle warmth. Winston Churchill, her first prime minister, was almost a grandfather figure in her early reign, his experience guiding her as she found her footing. Over the decades, she met weekly with her prime ministers, a ritual that became a quiet masterclass in diplomacy. Some, like Harold Wilson, she grew genuinely fond of. Others, like Margaret Thatcher, remained more formal, their interactions respectful, but never quite easy. Yet with each, she listened more than she spoke, her vast experience allowing her to offer counsel without overstepping. A steady presence through the ever-shifting tides of politics, perhaps the most public and fraught of her relationships, was with Diana, Princess of Wales. Initially, there was hope that Diana's warmth and modernity would breathe new life into the monarchy, but as the marriage crumbled and Diana's struggles played out in the press, the Queen found herself caught between family loyalty and public expectation. In the raw aftermath of Diana's death, the Queen's initial reserve was misinterpreted as coldness, a miscalculation that taught her how deeply the monarchy's survival depended on its connection to the people's emotions. Her eventual televised address, though brief, was a turning point, proof that even a sovereign could learn, could adapt, when the moment demanded it. Through all these relationships, one truth remained. The Queen understood that love and duty were not opposites, but intertwined. She held people at just the right distance, close enough to care, but never so close that personal feeling clouded her judgment. Her life was a lesson in the art of connection, in how to be present without losing oneself. And as you drift toward sleep, imagine her now, in the quiet moments between ceremonies and speeches, laughing with Philip over a private joke, walking arm in arm with her mother in the gardens of Balmoral, bending down to scratch a corgi behind the ears. These small, unguarded instances were the heart of her story, the quiet pulses of a life lived in service, but also in love. So let your breathing slow, your thoughts soften, as the tapestry of her relationships unfolds in your mind, each thread a reminder that even the longest reign, the most public of lives, was built on the simple, enduring power of human connection. Sleep now, wrapped in the warmth of that truth, as gently as she herself might have wished for you. Allow yourself to sink deeper into comfort as we explore the next phase of this soothing biography, beyond the grand halls of state banquets and the weight of the crown. Queen Elizabeth II cherished the quiet, unhurried rhythms of her private life. She was, above all, a creature of habit, finding comfort in routines that grounded her amidst the whirlwind of royal duties. Each morning, no matter where she was, Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, or the Scottish Highlands, she awoke to the same ritual. A pot of Earl Grey tea poured into a fine china cup brought to her bedside with quiet precision. The scent of bergamot filled the room as she leafed through the morning papers, her reading glasses perched lightly on her nose. It was a small moment of stillness before the day's demands began, one she guarded carefully. Breakfast was another quiet affair, often taken alone or with Prince Philip when their schedules allowed. She preferred simple foods, toast with marmalade, a bowl of cereal, sometimes fresh fruit eaten without fuss, the clink of silverware against porcelain, the rustle of a newspaper, the occasional murmur of conversation with a nearby aide or a passing corgi. These were the sounds of her mornings, unhurried and peaceful. Her love of horses was one of the great joys of her life, a passion inherited from her father and nurtured since childhood. There was something deeply calming about the stables, the soft snuffling of the horses, the scent of hay and leather. She visited them daily when possible, running a hand down a velvety nose or watching with quiet pride as a young foal took its first wobbly steps. Riding was more than a hobby. It was a release, a way to move through the world with freedom and grace. Even in her later years, she would saddle up for gentle rides through the grounds of Windsor, the rhythm of hoofbeats matching the steady pace of her thoughts. And then there were the dogs, her beloved corgis, with their short legs and boundless energy. They trailed after her like a loyal retinue, their paws clicking on palace floors, their cheerful barks echoing down corridors. She fed them herself, often by hand, and knew each of their quirks, which one was prone to stealing socks, which one liked to nap in the sunniest spot by the window. Their presence was a constant, a reminder of life's simple pleasures. Her relationship with Prince Philip was the steady foundation upon which so much of her personal happiness rested. Their bond was forged in laughter and mutual respect, a partnership that weathered decades of public scrutiny and private challenges. They had their own language, a shorthand of shared jokes and knowing glances. In the evenings, after the day's duties were done, they might sit together with a drink, gin and Dubonnet for her, a cold beer for him, discussing everything from family matters to the latest headlines. When the weight of the crown grew heavy, family was her anchor, though it was not without its complexities. She adored her children, even as their lives took paths that sometimes diverged from tradition. With her grandchildren, she was softer, more indulgent, ready with a sweet from the ever-present tin of chocolates on her desk, or a patient ear for their stories. Princess Anne once remarked that her mother had a way of making you feel like the only person in the room when she spoke to you, a gift of presence that made even brief moments together feel meaningful. Her sister, Margaret, was both a joy and a sorrow in her life. Their childhood had been one of closeness, two little girls playing in the gardens of Royal Lodge, whispering secrets under the covers at night. As adults, the demands of the crown and Margaret's restless spirit sometimes pulled them apart, but the love never faded. In later years, they would sit together at Balmoral, watching the Highland mist roll over the hills, speaking less, but understanding more. When Margaret passed, the Queen carried that loss quietly, as she did so many things privately, with dignity. Balmoral itself was a sanctuary, a place where she could shed some of the formality of monarchy. There she wore well-worn tweeds and sturdy walking shoes, her hands free of gloves, as she pulled on her gardening clogs to tend the roses. The Scottish air was crisp and clean, the rhythms slower, the days shaped by the land rather than the clock. She liked to picnic by the river, the basket packed with simple sandwiches and slices of fruitcake, the sound of the water mingling with birdsong. In the evenings, there might be a jigsaw puzzle spread out on a table, or a book she favored, historical biographies and detective novels, read by the fire as the logs crackled softly. Her faith was another quiet constant, a deeply personal thread woven through her life. She attended church not out of obligation, but out of genuine belief, finding solace in the familiar words of the liturgy, the soaring notes of a hymn. It was a faith that asked for humility, for service, values that mirrored her own sense of duty. Even in her public role, she sought moments of ordinary connection. She had a knack for putting people at ease, asking after their families, remembering small details from previous conversations. A farmer showing her prize cattle, a veteran recalling his wartime service, a child presenting her with a bouquet. She met each with the same steady attention, a reminder that beneath the crown was a woman who understood the weight of a shared smile, a listening ear. As the years passed, she grew more comfortable in her own skin, more willing to let glimpses of her personality shine through. The twinkle in her eye during the 2012 Olympics, when she pretended to parachute with James Bond, the mischievous grin when she revealed the contents of her handbag in a rare interview. These were small rebellions against the formality of her role, tiny breaths of lightness in a life so often defined by duty. And so, as you drift toward sleep, picture her not in robes of state, but in the quiet, in-between moments that made up the heart of her days, walking through the gardens at Sandringham, her gloved fingers brushing the petals of a rose, sitting at her desk, signing letters with her distinctive, looping handwriting, laughing as a corgi tumbles into her lap, or leaning into Philip's shoulder during a rare, quiet evening. These were the fragments of a life well lived, a reminder that even the most extraordinary of lives is built on ordinary moments, soft, unremarkable, and deeply precious. Let the image of her steady presence soothe you now. As the night deepens and the world grows still, breathe in, breathe out, and rest, cradled in the quiet certainty that even monarchs need stillness, need love, need the small and sacred rituals that make us human. Sleep well, knowing that her story, like all great stories, was woven not just of grand events, but of whispered conversations, of hands held, of tea sipped slowly as dawn broke over the palace gardens. like a gentle river flowing toward the sea. Our story continues with the next meaningful chapter. Imagine her mornings, beginning not with fanfare, but with quiet, before the world stirred, before the duties of state pressed in. There was the hush of dawn. In her private quarters at Buckingham Palace, the curtains would part just enough to let in the first pale light of day. She never needed an alarm clock. Her internal rhythm, honed over decades, woke her naturally, often as early as 7. The first sounds were soft ones. The rustle of sheets, the distant murmur of palace staff preparing for the day, perhaps the padding of a corgi's paws across the carpet. Her morning routine was simple, unchanging in its comforting predictability. A bath drawn at the same temperature each day, the scent of her favorite soap, a light, floral fragrance lingering in the steam. She dressed with quiet efficiency, often with the help of her longtime dresser, who knew her preferences down to the last detail. Even in private, she favored neat, tailored skirts and blouses, though the fabrics were softer, the colors gentler than the bold hues she wore in public. A string of pearls, a simple watch, these were her constants, small anchors of familiarity in a life that demanded constant adaptation. Breakfast was a quiet affair, taken in her sitting room overlooking the palace gardens, a pot of Earl Grey tea, steeped just long enough, poured into a fine china cup. A slice of toast with marmalade, sometimes a boiled egg, the shell cracked neatly with a spoon. The morning papers were laid out for her, but she rarely lingered over them. There would be time for official briefings later. Instead, she might glance at the racing pages, her eyes skimming the names of horses with a knowing smile. By 9 o'clock, the rhythm of the day shifted. Her private secretary would arrive with the red boxes, those familiar leather-bound cases filled with government documents, letters from ambassadors, memos from ministers. She settled at her desk, a sturdy piece of furniture that had borne the weight of her work for years. The surface was always tidy, a blotter, a fountain pen, a framed photograph or two tucked to the side. Her handwriting, precise and flowing, filled the margins of reports as she made notes, asked questions, signed her name with the same steady hand that had signed 1,000 others before. The mornings passed in this quiet industry, broken only by the occasional interruption, a phone call from the Prime Minister, a brief meeting with a member of staff. But even then, the atmosphere remained calm, unhurried. She listened carefully, her responses measured, her posture upright but never rigid. There was a rhythm to it all, a cadence that had developed over years of practice, like the steady ticking of a well-made clock. Lunch was often light, taken privately unless there were official guests to entertain. A simple salad, perhaps some cold chicken, a slice of fruit for dessert. If the weather was fine, she might step outside for a few moments, walking slowly along the palace terrace, her hands clasped lightly behind her back. The gardens stretched before her, a green oasis in the heart of London, and for a little while she could simply breathe, letting the stillness settle around her. The afternoons varied. Some days were filled with audiences, the steady stream of dignitaries, ambassadors, and well-wishers who came to pay their respects. Other days were given over to more personal pursuits. She might visit the royal stables, running a hand down the neck of a favorite horse, murmuring soft words as the animal nuzzled her palm. Or she would retreat to her sitting room with a book, the pages turning slowly as she lost herself in a novel or a biography, the world outside fading for a little while. Tea was a ritual observed without fail. At 4 o'clock precisely, the tray would arrive, china teacups, a plate of sandwiches with the crusts neatly removed, a few biscuits, or a slice of cake. If Philip was there, they would sit together, trading stories, sharing the easy silence of a long marriage. Sometimes, a corgi would curl at her feet, sighing contentedly as the afternoon light slanted through the windows. As evening approached, the pace slowed further. If there were no official engagements, she might change into something more comfortable, a cardigan, a softer skirt, before settling in for the evening. Dinner was often a quiet affair, though never rushed. The table was set with care, the silver polished, the crystal gleaming. She enjoyed good food, but never indulged excessively. A glass of wine, perhaps, but never more. Conversation was light, often sprinkled with laughter, especially if family were present. After dinner, there might be a film, played on the small projector she kept for private viewings. She loved historical dramas, stories of kings and queens who had faced trials not unlike her own. Or she might work on a jigsaw puzzle, the pieces clicking softly into place as the evening deepened. By 10 o'clock, the day began to wind down. A final cup of tea, a last glance at the next day's schedule. She moved through her nighttime routine with the same quiet precision as her morning, brushing her hair, laying out her clothes for the next day, perhaps pausing to look out the window at the stars over London. Then, at last, sleep. The bed was always turned down just so, the sheets crisp and cool. A book might rest on the nightstand, though she rarely read for long. The room was dark, quiet, save for the distant sounds of the palace settling for the night. And as she drifted off, the weight of the day lifting at last, she was simply a woman, tired, content, ready to rest before the cycle began anew. This was the rhythm of her days, steady as a heartbeat, ordinary in its way. But it was in these quiet moments, these small rituals, that she found the strength to be who the world needed her to be. And as you listen to this rhythm now, let it lull you too, gentle as a whisper, soft as the turning of a page. Breathe in, breathe out, and let yourself drift, carried by the quiet certainty of a life well lived. Sleep well, knowing that even queens need rest, need stillness, need the quiet cadence of days that begin and end in peace. As your thoughts grow quieter, we'll continue our peaceful exploration of this fascinating life. Queen Elizabeth II carried within her a philosophy shaped by quiet resolve, a deep sense of duty, and an unwavering belief in the power of continuity. From the moment she ascended the throne, she understood that her role was not merely to rule, but to serve, a principle instilled in her from childhood. Her father, King George VI, had shown her that leadership was not about power, but about responsibility, about standing firm in the face of change, while upholding traditions that anchored people's lives. And that was the essence of her belief, that her role was not to impose, but to unite, not to command, but to comfort. She saw herself as a steady presence in a world that often felt chaotic, a reminder that some things, duty, loyalty, service, remained constant, even as everything else shifted around them. Her worldview was shaped by the quiet rhythms of tradition, but also by an understanding that change, when handled with care, was inevitable. She had witnessed empires dissolve, nations transform, and societies evolve. Yet she never resisted progress outright. One of her most cherished values was resilience. She had lived through war, personal loss, and public scrutiny. Yet she never allowed herself to be bowed by hardship. During the darkest days of the Second World War, as a young princess, she had insisted on contributing to the war effort, training as a mechanic, a quiet act of defiance against the idea that royalty should remain untouched by struggle. That lesson stayed with her. She believed that true strength was not in never faltering, but in continuing forward despite the weight of the world. Her faith was another cornerstone of her life, a deeply private woman when it came to matters of spirituality. She nonetheless spoke often of the importance of quiet reflection, of prayer as a means of grounding oneself in turbulent times. In her Christmas broadcasts, she would weave in subtle reminders of the power of kindness, of forgiveness, of community, values that transcended any single religion, but were rooted in the idea that humanity was bound together by something greater than politics or borders. She had little patience for self-importance, despite her own position. That humility, that ability to put others at ease, was one of her greatest gifts. She understood that the true power of her role lay not in pomp or grandeur, but in the simple act of listening, of making people feel seen. Her sense of duty was absolute, but it was never joyless. She found pleasure in the small things, the companionship of her dogs, the crisp air of the Scottish Highlands, the laughter of her grandchildren. And so she did, allowing herself pockets of lightness, even amidst the weight of her responsibilities. Her approach to leadership was not one of bold declarations or dramatic gestures, but of quiet consistency. She believed that trust was built not in grand speeches, but in showing up day after day, year after year, without fail. When crises arose, whether personal scandals within the family or national tragedies, she did not rush to speak. She waited, considered, and then acted with measured grace. It is often better to say nothing until you are certain of what must be said, she once advised a young relative. One of the most revealing glimpses into her philosophy came not from a formal address, but from a casual remark made to a staff member. As they prepared for yet another state banquet, she noticed their exhaustion and said softly, "The secret is to remember that none of this is about us." That was the heart of it, her belief that service was not about the self, but about those who relied on you. As the decades passed, her perspective deepened but never wavered. She had seen empires rise and fall, technologies transform the world, and the very nature of monarchy shift beneath her feet. Yet she remained steadfast, not out of stubbornness, but out of a quiet conviction that some things were worth preserving, not for tradition's sake alone, but because they gave people a sense of stability in an uncertain world. In her final years, she often reflected on the passage of time with a kind of gentle acceptance. "The years teach much which the days never know," she would say, quoting Emerson. She had learned that wisdom was not seized, but accumulated like the slow growth of a tree, rings forming imperceptibly over time. And so, as the night settled around her, as the palace grew quiet and the stars shone over London, she would rest, content in the knowledge that she had done her best, not perfectly, not without missteps, but with a heart that never strayed from its purpose. And as you listen to these thoughts now, let them settle over you like a soft blanket, warm and reassuring. Breathe in, breathe out, and know that even the longest, most steadfast of lives are built on moments just like these, quiet, unhurried, full of quiet certainty. Sleep well, and may you wake with the same gentle strength that carried a queen through nearly a century of change. With each breath becoming slower and deeper, let us turn to another aspect of this soothing story. Her long reign, though marked by quiet dignity, was not without its trials. The weight of the crown, both literal and symbolic, was one she had not expected to bear so soon. She was only 25 when her father, King George VI, passed away, leaving her to take the throne far earlier than anyone had anticipated. The grief was profound, a private sorrow that had to be carried beneath the public gaze. But even in those early days, she understood that duty was not a burden to be set aside, but a responsibility to be shouldered with grace. She learned, as she would so often throughout her life, that strength was not the absence of doubt, but the willingness to move forward despite it. One of her greatest challenges came in the form of shifting public opinion. The monarchy, once an unassailable institution, began to face scrutiny as the world changed around it. The 1960s brought a wave of social upheaval, and the younger generation questioned traditions that had once seemed untouchable. There were moments when the institution felt fragile, as if the tides of history might sweep it away, but she remained steadfast, not by resisting change, but by adapting slowly, thoughtfully, like a ship adjusting its course to the winds. She allowed the monarchy to modernize in subtle ways, understanding that to endure, it must evolve. She opened the palace to television cameras, allowed her family to be seen in a more human light, and in doing so, reminded the world that tradition and progress were not enemies, but companions on the same long road. Then came the personal trials, the moments when the public and private intersected in ways that were deeply painful. The breakdown of her children's marriages played out in the glare of tabloid headlines, a spectacle that brought her no small measure of sorrow. She had always believed in the sanctity of family, and to see those bonds strained was a private grief made public. The fire at Windsor Castle in 1992, a year she would later call her annus horribilis asterisk, felt like a symbol of all that was crumbling around her. Yet even then, she did not retreat. She stood before the people, acknowledging the difficulties with quiet honesty, and in doing so, reminded them that even monarchs were not immune to life's storms. Perhaps one of the most painful moments came with the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. The public outcry, the accusations that the monarchy had been cold or distant, cut deeply for a woman who had always believed in the importance of composure. The demand for visible grief was a difficult balance to strike. But in time, she found a way to honor Diana's memory while still upholding the dignity of the crown. She spoke to the nation, not with grand gestures, but with simple, heartfelt words, proof that even in the face of overwhelming emotion, there was strength in stillness. Through all of this, she learned that setbacks were not failures, but lessons. Each challenge, each moment of doubt, became another ring in the tree of her wisdom. She understood that leadership was not about perfection, but about perseverance, about showing up day after day, even when the path was unclear. And so she carried on, not with grand declarations, but with small, steady acts of devotion. She wrote letters to soldiers, visited hospitals, listened to the stories of ordinary people with the same attentiveness she gave to world leaders. In these quiet moments, she found the true meaning of service, not in the fanfare of ceremony, but in the simple act of being present. As the years stretched on, she saw nations gain independence, wars begin and end, technologies reshape the very fabric of daily life. The world she had known as a young queen was gone, replaced by something faster, louder, more uncertain. Yet she remained a constant, a reminder that some things, though they may bend, need not break. She had faced criticism, weathered storms, and borne losses. But through it all, she had never lost sight of the quiet promise she had made so long ago. To serve, to endure, to be a steady hand in an unsteady world. And so, as the night deepened and the stars continued their silent watch, she could rest knowing that the challenges had not hardened her, but softened her, not into weakness, but into a deeper, more compassionate strength. The years had taught her that resilience was not about standing unmoved, but about bending without breaking, about about finding the grace to adapt without losing oneself. And as you drift into sleep now, let that thought linger, that even the greatest of lives are shaped not by their triumphs alone, but by the quiet courage with which they meet each obstacle. Breathe in, breathe out, and let the weight of the day melt away, just as the Queen herself learned to let go of what could not be changed, and to hold fast only to what truly mattered. Sleep well, and may your dreams be as peaceful as the resolve that carried her through nearly a century of unwavering service. The tapestry of this remarkable life unfolds further as we gently explore the next meaningful period. Beneath the polished public image, the regal waves, the steady gaze, the perfectly tailored coats, Queen Elizabeth II held within her a quiet world of simple pleasures and unexpected quirks. Few knew, for instance, that she had a mischievous sense of humor, one that surfaced not in grand speeches, but in small, private moments. She once playfully teased a visiting dignitary by pretending one of her corgis could curtsy, watching with quiet delight as the guest attempted to mirror the dog's non-existent bow. Laughter, when it came, was often a soft sound, held close among family or trusted staff, a reminder that duty did not erase joy, only tempered its expression. She had a way with animals that went far beyond the well-known love of her corgis. Long before she became queen, as a young princess, she was deeply involved in breeding and training dogs, not just as a hobby, but with genuine expertise. She understood their temperaments, their quirks, and could often be found walking them herself, without ceremony, enjoying the quiet rhythm of their paws against the earth. Horses, too, were a lifelong passion. She rode with skill and grace well into her later years, not for show, but for the sheer pleasure of it, the wind in her face, the steady rhythm of hooves, the uncomplicated companionship of a creature that asked nothing of her but kindness. In the early mornings, before the weight of the day settled upon her, she would sometimes slip away to the stables, running her hands over a horse's neck, murmuring softly. Those who worked with her there spoke of how she remembered every name, every lineage, as if these creatures were as much a part of her story as the people who shaped her reign. It was in these moments, away from cameras and protocol, that she seemed most at ease, just a woman who loved the quiet presence of animals, who found solace in their constancy. Behind closed doors, her tastes were surprisingly unpretentious. She enjoyed simple meals, often preferring plain grilled fish or a modest salad to the elaborate banquets served in her honor. There was a story, passed among palace staff, of how she once requested a jam sandwich, just bread and strawberry jam, after a particularly formal dinner, as if to remind herself that even queens crave small comforts. Tea was taken without fuss, strong and milky, the way so many ordinary Britons took theirs. And though she lived surrounded by priceless art and antiques, her private spaces were filled with well-worn books, family photographs, and the occasional crossword puzzle, which she tackled with quiet determination. Music, too, held a special place in her heart. Though she was often seen at grand concerts and operas, her private tastes were more eclectic. She had a fondness for the harmonies of Scottish folk music, the lilting melodies of the bagpipes that reminded her of Balmoral, the place where she felt most at home. And on rare occasions, when no one was listening, she would hum along to the tunes of her youth, songs from the war years, the ones that had played on the radio when she was just a girl. Before the crown had settled on her head, one of her lesser-known talents was her ability to fix small mechanical things. During the war, when she trained as a mechanic and driver in the Auxiliary Territorial Service, she learned not just how to drive heavy vehicles, but how to take them apart and put them back together again. Years later, she would still occasionally tinker with clocks or gadgets, her hands remembering the motions of those younger days. There was something grounding in it, she thought, the satisfaction of solving a tangible problem, of making something work again. She also had a surprising love of the absurd. Though her public persona was one of dignified restraint, those closest to her knew she enjoyed the occasional silly joke or playful prank. Once, while on a picnic at Balmoral, she hid a rubber duck in Prince Philip's fishing gear, waiting with quiet amusement for his reaction when he discovered it. Another time, she delighted in pretending not to recognize a disguised guest at a costume party, drawing out the charade with perfect deadpan delivery before finally breaking into a smile. Her faith was deep but quiet, a steady undercurrent rather than a loudly proclaimed virtue. She found comfort in the rhythms of prayer, in the familiar words of the Book of Common Prayer, in the stillness of private chapel services where no one watched or expected a performance. It was not about display, but about the quiet certainty that some things, truth, kindness, duty, transcended the chaos of the world. And then there were the small, unremarkable habits that made her human. She liked to watch television in the evenings, not just the news, but the occasional soap opera or nature documentary. She kept a notebook by her bedside, jotting down thoughts or reminders in a neat, steady hand. She worried, like any mother or grandmother, about the people she loved, fretting over their health or happiness in letters and phone calls that were never meant for public eyes. Perhaps most surprising of all was her willingness to adapt, even in the smallest ways. In her later years, she embraced technology with cautious curiosity, sending her first email in 1976, long before most of the world had even heard of such a thing. She laughed at the idea of herself as an Instagram follower, but she understood that the world was changing, and if she could not stop it, she could at least meet it with an open mind. These were the hidden facets of her, the woman behind the crown, the person beneath the title. She was not perfect, nor did she pretend to be. She grew impatient sometimes, sighed over paperwork, rolled her eyes at the occasional absurdity of royal tradition, but she also found joy in the smallest things: a well-brewed cup of tea, the sound of rain against the windows of Balmoral, the wag of a corgi's tail when she walked into the room. And so, as the night stretches on and sleep begins to settle over you, remember this: even the most extraordinary lives are made up of ordinary moments. The queen who reigned for 70 years was also a woman who loved dogs, who fixed clocks, who hid rubber ducks in fishing gear. She carried the weight of history, yes, but she also carried the quiet joys of a life well lived. And as you drift into dreams, may you too find comfort in the small things, the gentle, unremarkable moments that make us who we are. Breathe deeply, let go, and sleep, knowing that even the longest and most storied of lives were built, day by day, from the same simple threads that weave through all of ours. As you settle more comfortably, our narrative flows onward like soft moonlight across still waters. Queen Elizabeth II was born in 1926, a time when the world was still recovering from the echoes of the Great War. The British Empire, though vast, was beginning to show the first quiet signs of transformation. The roaring 20s carried on with jazz and flapper dresses, but beneath the glitter, there was a sense that the old order was shifting. Her childhood was spent in a world where telegrams were the fastest form of communication, where horse-drawn carriages still shared the streets with automobiles, and where the idea of a woman ruling alone, without a king by her side, was still a rarity in many places. When she was just 10 years old, her uncle, King Edward VIII, abdicated the throne for love, and her father reluctantly became King George VI. Overnight, her life changed. No longer just a princess who might one day marry into another royal family. She was now the heir presumptive, a young girl who would someday wear the crown. The weight of that future settled gently upon her, like the first snowfall of winter, quiet, inevitable, but not yet fully felt. Then came the war. In 1939, when she was 13, the world plunged into darkness once more. The bombings of London, the rationing of food, the distant thunder of conflict, these were the sounds of her adolescence. But even in those grim years, there were small moments of light. She and her sister, Margaret, broadcasted messages of hope to the children of Britain, their voices crackling over the radio, a reminder that even in wartime, life went on. At 18, she trained as a mechanic and driver in the Auxiliary Territorial Service, learning to change tires and repair engines, skills that would have been unthinkable for a princess in any earlier generation. The war shaped her in ways both seen and unseen, teaching her resilience, duty, and the quiet strength of ordinary people. When peace finally came in 1945, the world was irrevocably altered. The British Empire, already loosening at the seams, began its slow metamorphosis into the Commonwealth. India, the jewel in the imperial crown, gained independence in 1947, and one by one, other nations followed. The map was redrawn, the swift strokes of revolution, but with the careful negotiations of diplomacy. Elizabeth, by then a young wife and mother, watched as her future kingdom transformed before her eyes. The world was no longer one of unquestioned monarchy and colonial rule, but of independence movements, civil rights marches, and the slow, sometimes painful birth of new nations. She became queen in 1952, stepping into her role at the age of 25, far sooner than anyone had expected. Her father's early death left a nation mourning, and a young woman suddenly shouldering the weight of centuries of tradition. The post-war years were a time of rebuilding, not just of cities, but of societies. The welfare state took shape, the National Health Service was born, and Britain, though no longer the imperial power it once was, sought a new identity. Elizabeth, ever steady, became a symbol of continuity in a world that seemed to change by the hour. The 50s and 60s brought waves of cultural upheaval. Rock and roll, the rise of television, the sexual revolution, all of it unfolded as she carried out her duties with quiet grace. She was not a queen who sought the spotlight, but neither did she shy away from modernity. In 1953, her coronation was the first to be televised, a decision that brought the ancient ceremony into living rooms across the globe. Some in the palace worried it would cheapen the event, but Elizabeth understood that if the monarchy was to survive, it could not remain hidden behind palace walls. The swinging 60s, with their miniskirts and Beatles mania, might have seemed a world away from the restrained elegance of Buckingham Palace. But the Queen adapted. She allowed cameras into the royal family's private life for the groundbreaking documentary Royal Family Asterisk in 1969, letting the public see her not just as a distant figurehead, but as a mother, a wife, a person who laughed at jokes and barbecued sausages at Balmoral. It was a delicate balance, maintaining the mystique of monarchy while also letting the world in just enough. The 70s and 80s brought their own challenges. Economic turmoil, strikes, the rise of punk music with its anti-establishment snarl, all of it reflected a Britain that was restless, questioning old hierarchies. And then, in 1981, came the wedding of Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer, a fairy tale that would, in time, unravel in the most public way imaginable. The Queen, ever private, struggled to navigate the storm of media scrutiny that followed. The monarchy, which had seemed unshakable for so long, suddenly felt fragile, its future uncertain. But through it all, Elizabeth remained. She witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of apartheid in South Africa, the dawn of the digital age. She sent emails before most people had heard of the internet, and though she might have chuckled at the thought of tweeting, she understood that the world was moving forward, and so must the crown. Her reign spanned the advent of space travel, the rise of globalization, the tragedies of 9/11, and the hopeful election of Barack Obama. She met popes and presidents, astronauts and activists, each encounter a stitch in the vast tapestry of her time on the throne. And yet, for all the grandeur of her role, she never lost sight of the simple things. The crunch of autumn leaves underfoot at Balmoral, the warmth of a well-loved corgi curled at her feet, the ritual of tea taken just so. As the years passed, the world spun faster, but she remained a constant, a quiet anchor in turbulent seas. And when the time came for her to say goodbye, in the peaceful autumn of 2022, she left behind not just a legacy of service, but a reminder that even in a life of extraordinary duty, it is the small, ordinary moments that truly endure. So as you close your eyes tonight, let the weight of history settle softly around you. The world changes, empires rise and fall, but some things, a love for dogs, the comfort of routine, the sound of rain on a quiet evening, remain the same. Breathe deeply and sleep, knowing that even the grandest of stories are woven from the same gentle threads that shape us all. Let the rhythm of these words carry you further into relaxation as we continue our peaceful journey. Queen Elizabeth II was a quiet force in the ever-changing landscape of the modern world. Her presence, a steady hum beneath the noise of revolutions, tragedies, and triumphs. She did not shout her influence from the rooftops, nor did she seek to impose her will upon culture and society. Instead, she shaped the world in softer ways, through constancy, through ritual, through the quiet dignity of a life lived in service. Over 7 decades, she became more than a monarch. She became a symbol, a mirror reflecting both tradition and the slow, inevitable march of progress. In the early years of her reign, the world was still emerging from the shadow of war, and Britain clung to its past, even as it tentatively stepped into the future. The young queen, with her crisp voice and understated elegance, became a bridge between the old and the new. She did not resist change, but neither did she abandon the customs that gave her role its weight. The coronation in 1953, the first to be televised, was a moment of transformation, not just for the monarchy, but for how people connected to it. Millions watched in flickering black and white as the ancient ceremony unfolded, bringing the distant and ceremonial into living rooms across the nation. It was a quiet revolution, one that made the monarchy feel closer, more human, even as it retained its mystique. As the decades passed, she became a master of balance, honoring tradition while allowing the institution to bend, ever so slightly, with the times. She understood that her role was not to dictate culture, but to reflect it, to hold space for both the solemn and the spontaneous. When the Beatles received their MBEs in 1965, the photographs of the young musicians grinning beside her became iconic, a moment where the exuberance of youth met the weight of tradition. She did not resist the changing tides of music, fashion, or social norms. Instead, she allowed them to exist alongside her, creating a tapestry where the past and present could coexist. Perhaps one of her most profound impacts was in the realm of diplomacy and global perception. She was not a politician, nor did she wield power in the traditional sense, but her presence had a way of softening edges, of making the formal feel personal. State visits were not merely protocol, they were performances of quiet connection. A carefully chosen brooch, a question about a dignitary's family, a shared laugh over a minor mishap. These small acts built bridges where politics often erected walls. When she visited Ireland in 2011, a trip laden with centuries of tension, her few words in Gaelic and her gesture of respect at a memorial for those who had fought against British rule spoke volumes. It was a moment of healing, not because of grand declarations, but because of the quiet acknowledgement of shared history. At home, her influence was equally subtle, but no less profound. She did not preach about duty or service, she simply lived it, day after day, year after year. In a world that increasingly celebrated individualism and self-expression, her unwavering commitment to something larger than herself became a quiet counterbalance. Young people might not have aspired to be monarchs, but many absorbed the lesson that dedication and reliability were virtues worth cultivating. The way she spoke, measured, precise, never rushed, became a kind of antidote to the frenetic pace of modern life. Even her wardrobe, a symphony of bold, solid colors chosen so she could be seen in a crowd, was a lesson in thoughtful presence. Her relationship with the media evolved in fascinating ways. In the early years, the monarchy was shrouded in deference and distance. But as the world became more intrusive, she adapted without surrendering her privacy entirely. The documentary Royal Family Asterisk in 1969 offered a glimpse behind the curtain, showing her as a mother, a wife, a woman who barbecued at Balmoral. It was groundbreaking, but she soon pulled back, realizing that too much familiarity could erode the magic. Decades later, she allowed another controlled intimacy, this time through the clever staging of her James Bond sketch for the 2012 Olympics, where she appeared to parachute into the stadium alongside Daniel Craig. It was playful, unexpected, and perfectly calculated, a reminder that even the most traditional figures could wink at modernity. The rise of celebrity culture might have threatened to overshadow her, but instead, she became something rarer, a fixed point in a spinning world. While movie stars and influencers rose and fell with the tides of public opinion, she remained, her reputation untarnished by scandal or fleeting trends. She was not glamorous in the way of Hollywood, but she possessed something deeper, an aura of authenticity. People sensed that what they saw was what she was, no pretense, no carefully crafted persona. That consistency bred trust, and trust, over time, became a form of quiet power. Her impact on the arts was indirect but profound. She did not compose symphonies or write novels, but her presence inspired them. Plays, films, and television series explored the monarchy, sometimes critically, sometimes fondly, but always with the understanding that she was a figure worth examining, even in satire, like Spitting Image or The Crown Asterisk. The portrayal was never truly cruel, because beneath the caricature was a recognition of her humanity. She belonged to the people in a way few public figures ever do. And that meant she was theirs to celebrate, critique, and ultimately to love. In the realm of charity and public service, her influence was immeasurable. She did not simply lend her name to causes. She gave them her time, her attention, her visibility. Over 600 patronages benefited from her support, from wildlife conservation to youth development. She understood that her presence could amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard, and she used that power thoughtfully. When she visited a hospice or a community project, it was never a fleeting photo opportunity. It was a genuine engagement, a moment where people felt seen. That, more than any speech or decree, was her legacy in action. As the world grew louder, faster, more fragmented, she became a symbol of continuity. In the aftermath of 9/11, during the chaos of Brexit, through the isolation of the pandemic, her annual Christmas broadcasts were a touchstone, a moment where the nation could pause and listen to a voice that had been there through war and peace, joy and sorrow. Her words were never inflammatory, never divisive. They were gentle reminders of shared values, kindness, resilience, community. In an age of shouting, her quiet words carried further. And then, of course, there were the corgis, those small, sturdy dogs trotting at her heels became more than pets. They were part of her iconography, a symbol of her personal joys amidst the grandeur of her role. They humanized her, made her relatable in a way that crowns and carriages never could. People who would never meet her could imagine her tossing a ball for them, scratching behind their ears, enjoying a moment of simple pleasure. In that, she reminded the world that even those who seem most distant are, at heart, not so different from anyone else. When she passed in 2022, the outpouring of grief was not just for a queen, but for a constant, a figure who had been there for so long that her absence felt like a shift in the air itself, the queues stretching for miles to see her lying in state, the sea of flowers outside Buckingham Palace, the silence that fell over crowds as her funeral procession passed. All of it spoke to a connection deeper than politics or pageantry. She had become part of the rhythm of life, like the changing of the seasons, and her passing was felt not as the end of an era, but as the closing of a long, familiar chapter. Her legacy is not in grand reforms or sweeping changes, but in the quiet ways she shaped how people think about duty, about continuity, about the balance between the personal and the public. She showed that it was possible to adapt without losing oneself, to lead without dominating, to serve without surrendering one's humanity. In a world that often feels unmoored, her life was a reminder that some things, decency, perseverance, quiet strength, endure. So as you drift toward sleep tonight, think of her not as a distant figure of history, but as someone who, in her own way, understood the value of small moments, the warmth of a dog at her feet, the sound of rain on the palace windows, the ritual of tea taken just so. In those ordinary details, she found the grace to carry out an extraordinary life. And in doing so, she left behind a legacy that feels not like a monument, but like a quiet, comforting presence, still lingering in the air. Breathe deeply and rest with the gentleness of falling snow. We transition now to another meaningful chapter in this life story. There was something deeply reassuring about Queen Elizabeth II, the way she moved through the world with quiet grace, her presence like the steady ticking of a grandfather clock in a quiet room. Even in moments of great formality, there was always a touch of warmth, a glimmer of the woman behind the crown. One of the most endearing things about her was her love of animals, particularly her corgis. Over the course of her life, she owned more than 30 of them, each one a beloved companion. They were more than just pets. They were part of her daily routine, trotting alongside her in the corridors of Buckingham Palace, curling up at her feet during private moments. She even bred them herself, carefully selecting their names, which often had a playful touch. One of her favorites, Willow, was named after the trees in the palace gardens, and she was known to personally feed them from delicate porcelain dishes. But her affection wasn't limited to dogs. She was an accomplished horsewoman, riding well into her later years, and her knowledge of breeding and racing was so deep that trainers and jockeys often sought her advice. She had a keen eye for a thoroughbred, and some of her horses went on to win major races. There's a lovely story about how, during a visit to the United States, President Ronald Reagan, a fellow horse enthusiast, took her riding at his California ranch. They cantered through the hills, two world leaders briefly free from protocol, sharing nothing more than the simple joy of being on horseback. Her sense of humor, often dry and understated, was another delightful aspect of her personality. During a state banquet in 2011, an aide accidentally spilled a glass of wine on the table in front of her. The room, initially tense, dissolved into relieved laughter, and she had a remarkable ability to put people at ease, even in the most unusual circumstances. In 1982, a man named Michael Fagan famously broke into Buckingham Palace and found his way into her bedroom. Startled but composed, she kept her calm, engaging him in conversation while discreetly pressing the alarm button. When he asked for a cigarette, she politely told him she didn't have any, a moment so ordinary it almost felt surreal. Security eventually arrived, and she simply carried on with her day, refusing to let the incident rattle her. That unshakable poise was one of her defining qualities. Her dedication to duty was legendary, but it was the small, personal gestures that revealed her thoughtfulness. Every year, without fail, she sent handwritten birthday cards to those who reached their 100th birthday or 60th wedding anniversary. In the UK, the recipients often spoke of how much it meant to them. A note in her elegant script, a tangible connection to a monarch who cared about their milestones. She also made a point of writing letters of condolence to families who lost loved ones in service to the country, taking the time to acknowledge their sacrifice in a deeply personal way. One of the most touching stories from her early reign involves her sister, Princess Margaret. In the 1950s, Margaret fell in love with group Captain Peter Townsend, a divorced man. At the time, the Church of England did not permit remarriage after divorce, and as head of the church, the Queen was caught in a difficult position. Though she sympathized with her sister, she couldn't give official approval to the match. It was a painful moment for both of them. But in private, Elizabeth was said to have wept over the situation. Years later, when Margaret herself divorced, the Queen made sure her sister was never isolated, always keeping her close within the family fold. Her adaptability was another quiet strength. She embraced new technologies when it served her role, becoming the first British monarch to send an email in 1976, long before most people even knew what email was. Later, she joined social media, sending her first tweet in 2014 with a simple, charming message. It is a pleasure to open the Information Age exhibition today at the Science Museum, and I hope people will enjoy visiting. But for all the grandeur of her position, she cherished the simplest of pleasures. She was known to enjoy watching television in the evenings, particularly historical dramas and detective shows like Midsummer Murders, ***. She also had a fondness for crossword puzzles, often doing them in ink, a testament to her confidence. And then there was her love of tea, always taken the same way, a splash of milk, no sugar, poured into the cup first so the tea wouldn't crack the fine china. It was a small ritual, but one she held dear, a moment of calm in a life that was anything but ordinary. As you close your eyes tonight, picture her in those quiet moments, stroking a corgi's head, sipping her tea, or looking out over the palace gardens as the sun sets. She was a queen, yes, but also a woman who found joy in the little things, who carried the weight of history with grace, and who, in her own steadfast way, made the world feel just a little more steady. Sleep well, knowing that some legacies are woven not in grand gestures, but in the gentle, enduring threads of a life well lived. As your eyelids grow heavier, we'll softly explore another dimension of this fascinating biography. In her later years, Queen Elizabeth II carried herself with the same quiet dignity that had defined her reign, though the weight of time could be seen in the slight stoop of her shoulders, the slower pace of her walk, yet her presence remained as steady as ever, a reassuring constant in a world that often seemed to change too fast. She continued her duties with unwavering dedication, attending state events, meeting foreign dignitaries, and supporting countless charities. Even as the years crept up on her, there was something profoundly comforting in her constancy. The way she appeared on Christmas Day without fail, her voice warm and measured as she delivered her annual message, or how she stood on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, smiling gently at the crowds below, a figure of continuity in an ever-shifting age. She had seen so much: the rise and fall of empires, the birth of new nations, the transformation of technology that reshaped the way people lived. And yet, through it all, she remained rooted in tradition, while never being afraid to adapt when necessary. In her 90s, she still made history, becoming the first British monarch to reach a platinum jubilee, 70 years on the throne. The celebrations that followed were a testament to the love and respect she had earned over the decades. Streets were lined with Union Jacks. Concerts were held in her honor, and people from all walks of life came together to celebrate a reign that had spanned generations. It was a moment of collective reflection, a chance for the world to pause and appreciate the quiet strength of a woman who had served so faithfully for so long. Even in her final years, she never truly stepped back, though she allowed younger members of the royal family to take on more responsibilities. She still carried out engagements, her presence a reassuring touchstone. One of her last major public appearances was to welcome a new prime minister. Just 2 days before her passing, it was a small but deeply symbolic act, proof that duty came first, always. And when the news of her death finally came, it felt as though the world exhaled in unison, a collective moment of stillness. The tributes poured in from every corner of the globe, not just from leaders and dignitaries, but from ordinary people who had grown up with her as a fixture in their lives. For many, she had been the only monarch they had ever known, a steady presence through wars, crises, and personal milestones. Her funeral was a spectacle of solemn beauty, a carefully choreographed farewell that blended centuries-old tradition with personal touches. The sound of bagpipes drifted through the air as her coffin was carried through the streets of London, draped in the royal standard, the crown resting atop it, glinting in the muted autumn light. Millions watched as the world said goodbye, not just to a queen, but to an era. It was a reminder that, beneath the titles and the ceremony, she had been a mother, a grandmother, a woman who loved and was loved in return. Her legacy is woven not just in the grand historical events she witnessed, but in the small, everyday ways she touched lives. She modernized the monarchy without losing its essence, making it more accessible while still maintaining its mystique. Her reign saw the Commonwealth evolve, her genuine affection for its member nations, fostering a sense of unity that transcended politics. She was a patron of over 600 charities, many of which focused on education, wildlife conservation, and the welfare of young people. Her support was never just ceremonial. she took a personal interest, attending events, meeting beneficiaries, and using her influence to shine a light on causes that mattered. And then there were the quieter contributions, the ones that didn't make headlines, but left just as lasting an impression. The way she put people at ease with her dry wit, the letters she wrote to strangers who had suffered loss, the small acts of kindness that never sought publicity. She understood the power of presence, of simply showing up, whether it was at a hospital bedside or a school opening. Her reign was marked not by grand pronouncements, but by a lifetime of service delivered with quiet consistency. As the years go on, her impact continues to be felt. The institutions she supported still thrive. The causes she championed still inspire. The monarchy itself, though evolving, carries her imprint, the balance of tradition and adaptability she so carefully maintained. And for those who remember her, there is a certain comfort in recalling her voice, her smile, the way she carried herself with such unshakable grace. She was not perfect, no one is, but she was steadfast, a reminder that duty and devotion can shape a life, and through that life, a world. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, think of her not just as a queen, but as a woman who found beauty in the ordinary, who cherished her tea and her dogs, who worked crossword puzzles in ink because she never second-guessed herself. Think of her watching the sunset over the gardens of Windsor, or laughing at a joke only she seemed to fully appreciate. Her life was long, her legacy enduring, but perhaps what matters most is the quiet reassurance she gave that some things, some people, remain constant, no matter how much the world changes. And in that thought, there is peace. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and rest, knowing that history is made not only in great moments, but in the small, steadfast acts of a life well lived. Sleep well and dream of gentle legacies. The gentle cadence of our story continues, flowing like a peaceful stream through the next chapter. There is something deeply comforting in the thought of continuity, of a presence so steady that it becomes woven into the fabric of time itself. Queen Elizabeth II was one such presence, a figure whose influence did not fade with the years, but instead settled quietly into the foundations of the world she helped shape. Even now, long after her passing, her legacy lingers, not in loud declarations, but in the quiet persistence of values she embodied, in the institutions she nurtured, and in the countless lives she touched without fanfare. Consider the way she approached duty, never as a burden, but as a quiet promise kept. This idea, so simple yet so profound, has rippled through generations. Young leaders today, whether in politics, charity, or public service, often speak of her example when describing their own commitment to responsibility. They may never wear a crown, but they carry forward her belief that leadership is not about power, but about presence, about showing up, listening, and serving without expectation of reward. In hospitals, schools, and community centers around the world, There are people who never met her yet strive to emulate her grace under pressure. Her ability to bring calm to chaotic moments, the monarchy itself, an institution she both preserved and gently modernized, remains a testament to her careful balance of tradition and change. She understood that to endure, traditions must breathe. They must adapt without losing their essence. Today, the royal family continues to navigate this delicate dance, upholding ceremonial customs while engaging with contemporary issues in ways that would have been unthinkable decades ago. The causes she championed, conservation, youth development, the welfare of veterans, still flourish under the patronage of her successors, who build upon her work while adding their own voices. The Queen's Green Canopy, an initiative to plant trees across the UK in honor of her Platinum Jubilee, continues to grow, a living tribute to her love of nature and her belief in leaving the world better than she found it. And then there were the quieter contributions, the ones that didn't make headlines, but left just as lasting an impression. The way she put people at ease with her dry wit, the letters she wrote to strangers who had suffered loss, the small acts of kindness that never sought publicity. These gestures live on in the countless individuals who, inspired by her example, practice kindness without expectation of recognition. Teachers who stay late to comfort a struggling student, nurses who hold the hand of a frightened patient, volunteers who write letters to the lonely, all of them, in their own way, continue the quiet work of compassion she modeled so effortlessly. Her influence even extends into the realm of art and culture, where filmmakers, writers, and playwrights revisit her life not as myth, but as a deeply human story. Recent portrayals have shown her not just as a monarch, but as a woman who navigated immense pressure with resilience and humor. These reinterpretations invite new generations to see her not as a distant figurehead, but as someone who faced challenges not unlike their own loss, doubt, the relentless passage of time, and met them with quiet dignity. Of course, no legacy is without its complexities. The world she reigned over was one of immense change, and some of the institutions she represented have been questioned, debated, and re-examined in the years since. Yet even in these conversations, her personal example often serves as a touchstone, a reminder that individuals within systems can still embody integrity, even as the systems themselves evolve. Historians and commentators now speak of the Elizabethan paradox, the way she managed to be both a symbol of tradition and a subtle force for modernization, all while maintaining an aura of timelessness. For those who remember her, there is a certain comfort in recalling her voice, her smile, the way she carried herself with such unshakable grace. She was not perfect, no one is, but she was steadfast, a reminder that duty and devotion can shape a life, and through that life, a world. And in a time when so much feels uncertain, that steadiness is itself a kind of gift. As as you drift toward sleep tonight, think of the many ways her legacy endures, not in grand monuments, but in the small, everyday acts of kindness and commitment that keep her spirit alive. Think of the young girl who reads a book about her and dreams of making a difference, the elderly veteran who still treasures the letter she once sent him, the gardener who plants a tree in her memory, knowing it will grow for decades to come. Her life was long, her impact immeasurable, but perhaps what matters most is the quiet reassurance she left behind, that some things endure, that goodness persists, and that a single life, lived with purpose, can gently shape the future. So breathe deeply, let your thoughts soften, and imagine the world she helped create, a world where duty is a quiet promise, where kindness is its own reward, and where the past and future meet in the steady rhythm of a life well lived. Sleep well, and may your dreams be as peaceful as the legacy she left behind. Wrapped in the comfort of these words, we'll drift together into the next part of this soothing biography. In the quiet hours of the night, when the world slows and thoughts grow softer, it is easy to let history settle into simple shapes, neat stories with clear edges, where heroes and figures of the past are polished into symbols rather than people. Queen Elizabeth II is no exception. Over time, her long and storied reign has been smoothed into legend, her complexities softened, her struggles folded away like well-kept letters in a drawer. But like all lives, hers was far richer, far more textured than the myths that have grown around her. One of the most enduring misconceptions is that she was always the poised, unshakable figure we remember in her later years. The truth is, she was young once, just 25, when the weight of the crown settled upon her head. The image of her as an eternal monarch, unchanging and unwavering, forgets the very human adjustments she had to make, the private doubts she surely carried in those early days. She did not step into her role with the effortless grace of someone born to it. She grew into it day by day, year by year, learning as she went. Another myth is that she was untouched by the tides of emotion, that she embodied a kind of serene detachment from the personal struggles that shape ordinary lives. But those who knew her spoke of her wit, her laughter, even her occasional impatience, small reminders that she was as human as anyone else. She grieved deeply, whether for the loss of her father, the collapse of her children's marriages, or the passing of friends and loved ones. Her famous restraint was not indifference. It was a choice, a discipline, a way of upholding the dignity of her role, even when her heart may have ached. Then there is the idea that she resisted change, that she clung to tradition out of stubbornness rather than thoughtful consideration. The truth is more nuanced. She understood the power of continuity, the reassurance of stability in a rapidly shifting world. But she was not opposed to evolution. Under her reign, the monarchy modernized in quiet but meaningful ways, small adjustments in protocol, subtle shifts in public engagement. Even the gradual opening of royal life to greater transparency, she balanced the old and the new with care, knowing that too much change too quickly could unsettle, just as too little could isolate. Some have painted her as a distant figure, remote behind palace walls, disconnected from the lives of ordinary people. But those who met her, even briefly, often spoke of her remarkable ability to make a person feel seen. She had a way of listening, of asking just the right question, of remembering small details about people's lives, her famous walkabouts, her visits to hospitals and schools, her quiet acts of charity. None of these were mere formalities. They were the work of someone who understood that leadership, at its heart, is about connection. And then there is the question of power. It is easy to assume that as queen, she wielded immense influence over political matters, that her voice shaped policies and decisions. But the reality of constitutional monarchy is far more restrained. Her role was not to govern, but to symbolize, to unify, to advise rather than command. She met weekly with her prime ministers, offering counsel drawn from decades of experience, but she never overstepped the boundaries of her position. This delicate balance being present, but not overbearing, influential, but not interfering, was one of her quietest and most understated achievements. Perhaps the most overlooked aspect of her life was the sheer endurance it required to wake each morning knowing that every word, every gesture, would be scrutinized, to live a life so thoroughly in the public eye, with so little true privacy, would have worn on anyone. And yet she did it, not with resentment, but with a kind of quiet acceptance. She understood that her life was not entirely her own, that she belonged, in some ways, to the people she served. That kind of lifelong devotion is difficult to fathom. And yet, she made it seem almost effortless. Even her famous love of corgis and horses, often treated as charming quirks in popular retellings, were deeper than they appeared. Her affection for animals spoke to a need for simplicity, for companionship uncomplicated by the demands of public life. In the gentle routines of feeding her dogs or riding in the quiet of the countryside, she found small pockets of peace, moments where she could simply be herself. As sleep begins to settle over you, let these layers of her story unfold slowly in your mind. Remember that behind the legend was a woman full of contradictions, strengths, vulnerabilities, and quiet determination. Her legacy is not just in the grand moments of history, but in the small, steadfast ways she lived her life, day after day, year after year. And so, as you drift toward dreams, let the complexities of her story remind you that no life is simple, no legacy without its shadows and light. She was not a figure from a fairy tale, but a real person who navigated an extraordinary path with grace, resilience, and an abiding sense of duty. And in that truth, there is a deeper comfort, a reminder that even the most iconic lives are made up of ordinary moments, of choices both big and small, of love and loss, and the quiet courage to keep going. Sleep well, and may her story, in all its richness, bring you rest. Now, as we continue our gentle journey through this remarkable life, let us explore the next chapter as you settle deeper into the quiet embrace of night. Let us reflect on the life of Queen Elizabeth II, a woman who became not just a monarch, but a symbol of continuity in a world that changed more rapidly than any century before it. Her reign spanned decades, a tapestry woven with threads of duty, devotion, and quiet resilience. To think of her is to think of constancy, of a presence so steady that it seemed as unchanging as the tides. Yet, beneath that calm exterior was a life of profound complexity, of joys and sorrows carried with grace. She was not born to rule, not at first. The twists of fate that placed her on the throne were unexpected. And yet, when the crown was placed upon her head, she accepted it not as a burden, but as a sacred promise. Over 70 years, she stood as a quiet witness to history. Wars ended, empires transformed, technologies invented that would have seemed like magic to the young princess she once was. Through it all, she remained a figure both distant and deeply familiar, a queen who belonged not just to one nation, but to the world. Her achievements were not marked by grand declarations or sweeping reforms, but by something far subtler, by the weight of her presence, by the way she embodied duty without ever needing to raise her voice. She understood that her role was not to dictate, but to serve, to be a steady hand in times of uncertainty. In moments of national grief, she was there, her words measured and comforting. In times of celebration, she was there too, a quiet smile hinting at the warmth she so carefully guarded. And yet, she was also a woman of private joys, a lover of horses, of the Scottish Highlands, of the simple pleasures of family life. She was a wife, a mother, a grandmother, navigating the same challenges as anyone else, though under the unrelenting gaze of public scrutiny. The losses she endured, her beloved Philip, her sister, her parents, were mourned not just as a queen, but as a human being. In these moments, she reminded the world that even those who seem untouchable are shaped by the same emotions that touch us all. Her legacy is not just in the institutions she upheld or the traditions she preserved, but in the way she adapted without ever losing sight of what mattered most. She welcomed prime ministers of all stripes, presided over a commonwealth that evolved beyond its colonial roots, and, in her final years, guided her nation through a pandemic with the same quiet resolve that had carried her through every challenge before. She did not seek to be loved, only to be steadfast. And yet, love found her anyway, in the hearts of those who saw in her not just a monarch, but a reassuring presence in an uncertain world. Today, she is remembered not as a distant figure of history, but as someone who felt remarkably present in the lives of millions. Her image is etched into coins, stamps, and memories, face that became as familiar as that of a grandmother one might visit on Sundays, the rituals she upheld, the Christmas broadcasts, the gentle wit she occasionally revealed, all wove her into the fabric of everyday life. She was not a queen who demanded attention, but one who earned it, slowly and surely, through the quiet accumulation of years. Her influence endures in the way we think about duty, about service, about the idea that some things are bigger than oneself. In an age of fleeting loyalties and shifting values, she stood as a reminder that some promises are meant to last a lifetime. The monarchy she leaves behind is different from the one she inherited changed, as all things must be, but still standing, still symbolizing something beyond the individual. And now, as sleep gently tugs at your thoughts, let the story of Queen Elizabeth II settle over you like a soft blanket. Think of her not as a distant icon, but as a woman who lived fully, loved deeply, and carried her burdens with quiet dignity. Her life was long, her impact immeasurable, and yet, in the end, she was human just as you are, just as we all are. May the rhythm of her story, the rise and fall of her years, the steadiness of her presence, lull you into peaceful rest. Imagine the rolling green hills of Balmoral, the quiet hum of a palace at dusk, the sense of time passing like the turning of pages in a well-loved book. Let these images carry you into dreams, where history and memory blend softly, where the past is not gone, but merely resting, waiting to be remembered when morning comes. Sleep now, and may the quiet strength of her legacy bring you comfort. The night is long, but dawn will come, just as it did for her, day after day, year after year. And as you drift away, know that even the grandest lives are made of small, tender moments, just like this one, here in the dark, where stories end and dreams begin. Good night, and may your rest be as deep and peaceful as the legacy she leaves behind.